Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, it was in the early spring of 2014 that I had a huge wake-up call that shook me so hard with such a profound jolt that quite literally enabled me to transform my life from the inside out in an instant. I was a young man at the time, in my early 30s, and not too bad looking, and in reasonable good shape. Well, so I thought, but I guess I was very good at deceiving myself. I was renting an illustrious, very elegantly fully furnished apartment in New York City, in Washington Heights, that is in close proximity to trendy bars, high-quality restaurants, whimsical coffee shops, and exquisitely beautiful parks with ubiquitous trees and verdant green grass, where the locals love to flock on warm sunny days and enjoy eating their sandwiches on park benches. It's an area where lots of professional people live and rent out apartments from local residents. I had been in a short marriage that had lasted only 2 years. I had returned home to my apartment one day to discover a note from my wife saying she wanted out of the marriage, and I never ever saw her again, although we legally got divorced through the postal system. I mean, how remote is that? What had gone wrong in our marriage, I wondered. I didn't know. I had truly thought we were happy, but I was clearly wrong. I felt like a complete loser and an absolute failure, and I wanted to run away from myself, but that is rather difficult when I'm stuck with myself all day. During the day I had a rather run-of-the-mill, humdrum job, working for a very mundane, prosaic company, doing a laborious, repetitive and tiresome job that I simply hated and despised. It was so dull and tedious that I literally wanted to tear my hair out. I was that frustrated by my life, as I literally lived for the weekends and after work hours. I would long for that clock to move its hands towards 5 o'clock. I was always the first to grab my briefcase and jacket and leave the office in an enthusiastic haste, which was a stunt that had not gone unnoticed by my superiors. My boss, Mr. Lieberman, had piped, "Steve, you are very keen to leave the office on the dot. You must have a very beautiful wife waiting for you at home," he teased. "You got that right, Mr. Lieberman," I would say, and I'd fly out the door like a witch on a broomstick. In the last few months, I'd returned home, put down my briefcase, removed the restrictive work clothing that I always wore to replace it with a casual cotton top and a comfortable pair of pants, and I would hastily make my way out of the apartment and walk across the road to the bar that I would regularly frequent, and then I would start drinking, as it helped me release all my inhibitions, as by nature I was rather inclined to be reserved and reticent. I think I was not consciously aware that I wanted to get drunk, but invariably I always did. Indeed, there were times that I was so intoxicated that I slept through the following day, only to wake up a day later, appalled to discover that I'd lost a whole day of my life. I mean, how does that happen? I had to phone up work and make up some dramatic excuse that I'd been unable to phone in sick, as my mother had just had a heart attack. Little did I realise my company had my mother's home address, and they sent her a bouquet of flowers, wishing her a very swift, fast recovery. "Why has your company sent me flowers, sweetheart?" my mother had said to me. "I'm not even sick." "Enjoy the flowers, mother," I said. "They were sent to you by mistake." Looking back, I think I truly found solace, consolation and comfort in drink. And there were always the same old people drinking with me late into the night, long after everybody else had long since left, and we had one thing in common: we all wanted to forget. There was Rudolph, who looked like a drunk, as his face was so red and puffed up, and his eyes as glazed as a dead fish, and he had about as much physical energy as a sloth. He stayed at the bar to avoid any contact with his belligerent nagging wife, who henpecked him from within an inch of his life whenever he returned home. Then there was Morris, who simply hated his job and became very aggrieved and upset when the junior assistant had received the promotion he believed he deserved. And finally there was Nicholas, who had been laid off from his job and had been hit by a tsunami of depression. One night, as we were sitting at the chairs around the bar, where there was a mirror at the back counter, while the bar manager kept refilling our glasses the moment they became empty, I remember looking at the mirror and thinking to myself, "Who is that big, pixated, ugly deadbeat sitting opposite me?" I felt very sorry for the poor man, for he looked like a complete and total shipwreck. "I'm glad I don't look like that," I thought smugly to myself. I watched the cockeyed, inebriated man, with his red, bloated face, downing his beer greedily. I nodded at him politely, as I realised he was staring directly at me, and I lifted up my beer in a gesture of friendliness, as if to say cheers, as it occurred to me that I had stared at him rather rudely. Then I had a blinding revelation that nearly threw me off the chair with a flying start. "Oh my God! The man that looked like a large red bullfrog, with a red face and gouging eyes, was my own reflection staring back at me in the mirror. It was me. I was mortified and felt as if someone had poured a bucket of ice-cold water over my face. When I glanced at my sloshed friends, I realised that they were as pathetic as I was. To an outsider or a casual observer, we would have looked like a club of bladdered jellyfish, as we sat there like great big blobs of translucent jelly, drinking ourselves to death. I promptly picked up my jacket and returned home swiftly, and decided from then forth that I was never ever going to drink again. I knew that one beer led to another and another. I simply had no willpower to stop, so I had to never drink again. It was the same with a bag of chips, as I was never happy until the last potato chip had finally been devoured. I remember walking to the mirror at home and staring aghast at my appalling reflection, as if seeing myself for the very first time. "My God, you're ugly," I thought to myself, staring at myself through critical eyes. "What the heck have you done to yourself?" I was young, but the excess drink had taken a heavy toll on my physical appearance. My eyes were round and puffy and almost bursting out of their sockets, and my face had gained some blobby cheek implants that had not been there before, and my Roman nose looked like a New York road map, as it was covered in red spiders' veins, and as for my skin tone, it was drained and dull. I had noticed my waistline had been growing considerably larger of late, possibly from the estrogen in all the beer I was drinking. I had been in complete denial. I considered myself fit, but looking at myself, warts and all, I was not a pretty sight. One of the secretaries at work had teased me and said, "You look like you're 3 months pregnant," and she'd pinched some of the fatty tissue around my waist, making me feel very self-conscious. "I was thinner than you in my first trimester," she boasted, and I secretly wanted to throttle her. The following morning, as I was shaving in the mirror, I remember realising I needed to do something to distract myself from drinking, So I offered to take the neighbour's dog, a little Scotty mix, Trixie, for walks around the park after work. My neighbour was an elderly lady in her 80s, and so my generous offer came as somewhat of a surprise to her. "How much are you charging?" she asked, looking at me suspiciously. "Nothing," I said. "You'll be doing me a great big favour. I need something to do to distract me from my alcohol addiction, and I don't want to walk around the park like a lemon without a dog." "Good for you," said the old lady. "You should be proud of yourself. Alcohol never did cure any problems. It only makes them worse, and Trixie would appreciate some exercise." I think Trixie thought her Christmases had all come at once, as every single day I walked her round the park, and her little tail never stopped wagging, and she lifted her leg up everywhere to announce to the doggy world that she was still very much around. Soon many of the locals interacted with me because of Trixie, and I was finding that the more I abstained from alcohol, the less I wanted it, and I could see with little effort my waist was beginning to shrink, and my face beginning to look more normal, and less like Mr. Blobby. One day as I was crossing the road with Trixie walking back to the apartment block, I noticed a familiar face sitting in a jeep, parked at the edge of the park. It was Rudolph, my old drinking partner. What was he doing sitting in his jeep, I wondered. I trotted over the road towards his car, and he unwound the window very reluctantly, and I was overwhelmed by the sour stench of sweaty, cheesy trainers and very, very bad body odour. I'd never seen Rudolph look so out of sorts before, as he rather reminded me of a vagrant with his dishevelled, bedraggled and scruffy appearance, and as I glanced towards the back of his car, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out he was living in his car, for everything from gas cookers to golfing equipment was lying precariously all over the place, resembling a very disorganised and disordered jumble sale. "What's going on, bro?" I asked. "The wife has finally seen sense and kicked me out, and I'm living out of my car. I got laid off my job because I looked so unkempt and unpresentable, and I'm an embarrassment to the company. Look at me. I'm a complete mess, bro." "Are you still drinking?" I asked. "No, I can't hang around a bar looking like this, but I am going to give the stuff up. It's completely ruined my life. Look at what I'm reduced to." "If you really mean that, you can come home with me," I said, "and sort yourself out." "But are you sure, bro?" said Rudolph, his face suddenly lighting up. "You sure I won't be a burden to you?" "Well, you will be if you start drinking again," I said. "If you do, I'll throw you out. Is that a deal?" "Deal," he said. After Rudolph moved in with me, things became more positive and life lifted, because it was rarely good to have company, and someone who seemed as determined as I was to quit drink, and was facing the same tumultuous, challenging journey to sobriety. At the time, Rudolph was heartily relieved to have a roof over his head, and while I was at work, he cooked delicious homemade meals, shopped and cleaned the apartment, as well as made appointments for job interviews, so the routine worked well for the both of us. One day, Rudolph and I decided to visit a therapist together, someone who had a great deal of experience in helping people to get off the wagon permanently, as we both lived with a paralysing fear that in a moment of weakness we could succumb to the drink. We were led by the receptionist into a very distinguished-looking smart office with an elegant oak wooden desk, with only a glass of mixed red roses gracing its surface. The turquoise walls of the office were covered in pictures of whales and dolphins, which suggested our therapist was rather passionate about the ocean. We noticed a couple of very comfortable white leather recliners, where she asked us to take our seats and wait. "Hello," said an attractive woman entering the room finally. She had shoulder-length bobbed hair, fair skin and blue eyes, and was very pretty. "I'm Dr. Limerick," she said, shaking our hands. "I'm very pleased to make your acquaintance." "Sorry, I thought you were going to be a man," I stammered awkwardly. "Is it a problem for you that I'm not?" she asked kindly. No, of course not," I said, flushing bright red with embarrassment. I have your reports here, she said, looking at them closely. I see both of you have issues with drink. What I'd like to establish today is the root cause of your drinking. The question is, what are you running away from? She said that looking directly at me, and then at Rudolph, through her blue eyes very intently. Is it not possible to just drink because you enjoy it so much that you just can't stop? I challenged her. Put it this way, said the therapist. If you go to an Italian restaurant, when do you stop eating? When I'm full, I said, but I do tend to overstuff myself. I fill up as much as I can. Exactly, she said. But when you drink, you can't stop. The question is, why? In my experience, excessive drinking is like a band-aid that is covering a deep hurt. We need to establish what that is so we can rip off the band-aid and allow the underlying wound to heal. Well, if you really want to know my problems, I said, feeling myself growing angry and the blood rising to my face, my bloody wife divorced me for no reason at all. Just left me a note and bogged off into the sunset just like that. Now that's one hell of a mean thing for her to do. And if you think that's not enough, I simply hate my job. I have to work with numbers day in and day out. Do you have any idea how boring that is? I'd sooner watch paint dry. Well done, said the therapist. Now we're getting somewhere. I'm glad to see your passion, for it reveals your anger, and that exposes your deep underlying hurt. As far as your wife leaving for no reason is concerned, said the therapist, now you and I know that that is not altogether true. You need to question yourself about your relationship with your wife and establish why you think she may have left you. No one ever leaves a relationship for no reason at all. That's nonsensical. You leave when things aren't working out. Well, I guess I didn't talk to her much, but I was tired when I got back from work. Maybe I did kind of ignore her, watching all my sports games and drinking a little bit of beer. I suppose I took her for granted. There you are, she said. You see, you already knew what your problem was with your marriage, and also about your job. If it really makes you so miserable, why don't you look for another job that will make you happy? I looked at the therapist with a bemused expression on my face. It's not that easy to get another job, you know. Do you realise how tough it is out there? It's all right for you to go casting judgments on me, sitting back here in your swanky office. Defeatist talk, said the therapist. You'll never find a job if you believe you won't. Word of advice, be very careful what you order from the universe. It's just like ordering from a restaurant menu. Choose your thoughts carefully. As for you, she said, turning to Rudolph, what's been hurting you in your life? My wife, said Rudolph. She's such a bully, and continuously henpecks me. I can't stand the sight of her. She reminds me of a squawking chicken. She races after me with a wooden spoon and speaks to me in broken English with her strong Portuguese accent. She whacks me with the spoon and screams blue murder at me. Half the time I don't even know what the heck she's going on about. So you allow yourself to be bullied and patronised, said the therapist. Do you have so little respect for yourself, and such a poor opinion? No wonder the woman doesn't respect you. Well, you can't beat a woman up, stammered Rudolph, trying to defend himself. Who said anything about beating up a woman, said the therapist. How can your wife look up to you when you're failing to stand up for yourself and be a man? If your marriage can't be fixed, move on, get a divorce. As simple as that, said Rudolph. Is that not rather extreme? I'll tell you what's extreme, said the therapist. Drinking all hours of the night to avoid going home. Now that is extreme. The therapist took out a piece of paper and began scribbling out something. This is your script, she said, for next week. I want the two of you to go camping for a few days. Get some fresh air and plenty of exercise. and I'll see you again when you get back next week." "Why?" I asked, looking perturbed. "In my experience, nature is an excellent healer and rejuvenator, and if you've been far removed from the natural world, you need to get reacquainted with her. And believe me, she'll help you get your life in perspective, and she's a good healer too." So there I was with Rudolph at a camping shop, purchasing a 2-man tent and everything else we would invariably need for camping. And then there we were, out on the road, taking the 362-mile road trip from New York to West Virginia, which was about 7 hours in the car. So we left early, so that we would arrive there by lunchtime. A work colleague of mine knew of a private camping ground where we could go camping, and according to her, the area was really exquisite. I must be honest, I was actually secretly rather excited about going camping, as I hadn't been camping before. And by the sounds of things, Rudolph was also a complete novice, so it was going to be one hell of an experience for the both of us, whatever way you looked at it. Before long, we found ourselves driving down all these bumpy, rocky roads that seemed to go on forever. We would pass high embankments with trees, farmers' fields, grazing cows and horses, pretty barns, flowering meadows and undulating countryside. "It's exquisite," gasped Rudolph, who was completely mesmerised by the scenery. "It's so good to get out of New York." Before long we reached a sign that read Singing Prairie Campground, and we drove through the open cattle gate until we came to a really beautiful silvery lake that was surrounded on the rear side by ubiquitous wood green, consisting of hickories, oaks, beeches, maples and yellow polars, and in the distance was the smouldering hazy silhouettes of the mountains that rose up in the sky like undulating pyramids. We parked our car under a large oak tree in the open gravel clearing that overlooked the lake, and to its rear was a large area of sagebrush that branched out into even more woods. The immediate clearing around the exquisitely beautiful lake, with its pretty scattering of sizable trees, was, we realised, the campground where we were expected to set up our camp for the night. For 2 city boys, we just stood and stared at the scenery in reverence and veneration, and we could see the white head of a bald eagle hovering above the lake, and we both took turns to study it through the binoculars. I was wonderstruck by how majestic and magnificent this noble bird of prey actually was. In a trice we set up camp, and everything seemed to flow seamlessly, and for 2 fledglings with very little experience, we weren't doing half badly at getting our act together. We decided to cook a very late lunch and early dinner over the fire pit, so we barbecued some juicy steaks and spicy burgers, which we ate with salad, bread rolls and macaroni cheese. Finally, with full, satisfied stomachs, we retired to our sleeping bags for an afternoon siesta, as we were both feeling the exhausting effects of being exposed to the fresh, heady oxygen of the beautiful mountain air. We must have awoken at 8 o'clock, and we sat on our camping chairs around the fire pit, staring up at the huge night sky, with its scattering of sparkling silvery stars and an almost full luminescent moon that basked the evening in an ethereal soft light. We drank back cups of cocoa and talked for a long while. It was an exquisitely tranquil and magical night, and we could see the subtle reflections of the silvery stars and the vase-shaped trees displayed on the surface of the lake like a mirror. And to add to the magnificence and magical mystique of this amazing evening, we were serenaded by the cheerful chorus of crickets and frogs. Finally, we decided to turn in for the night, but I quickly set up some battery-operated fairy lights into a couple of mason jars to light up our campsite, so that we could wake up in the night if nature called and not be exposed to the darkness. I awoke later during the night and glanced at my cell phone. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had a desperate need to relieve myself, so I climbed out of my sleeping bag cautiously and ambled through the sagebrush towards a maple tree. Once I'd finished my mission, I was just about to return to camp when I saw what I thought was a bear wandering around our campsite, possibly having been alerted to the smell of food that we'd recently grilled earlier on in the afternoon. I could not remember what the protocol was concerning bears, so I sneaked up behind a few trees to get a closer look at the creature, as I was rather concerned about Rudolph's safety in the tent. It hadn't even crossed my mind to bring a rifle or bear spray with us on this trip. I could see the bear walking around the tent, and he appeared to be inspecting it closely. But when I saw a hand touching the canvas, I thought, wait a minute, that's not a bear. A bear has paws. It doesn't have hands. But then what is this thing, I wondered. I could see the critter pulling out the Christmas lights from one of the mason jars, and I got the distinct impression he was very impressed by them, for he examined the string of light bulbs in his huge hands with an expression of wondrous awe on his face. And then I watched him glide away with the mason jar and the lights, and that was when I got a closer view of him, as the lights from the jar lit up his whole body, so that I could see him clearly. On seeing the critter at close range, my heart began to thunder through my chest like a powerful drum, and I could feel every vibration. I could see that this was an apex predator, something that demanded respect. I mean, he was seriously colossal, both in size and girth, with an incredibly powerful torso that was quite literally ripped with muscle. He had very strong, stocky short legs, and exceedingly long arms that hung well beyond his knees, and a low-slung cone-shaped head that simply folded into his Herculean-sized shoulders very seamlessly. I did not see the facial features, as they seemed too vague and obscure because they were dark, but I do believe his face had very evident human-like influences. I would describe him as half man and half beast, for his whole body was covered in long flowing hair. I did not discern a repugnant odour from the creature at all. In fact, I didn't smell anything, for indeed Rudolph had smelt far worse sleeping in his car like a dosser for days at a time, so the very fact that this wild creature didn't appear to stink was nothing short of astonishing. The critter was standing only yards away from me when he began to hoot exactly like an owl 3 times, and his hoots were brilliant. I was terrified. Had he sensed my presence, I wondered, and was he calling his friends to tell them that there was an easy meal close by that they could quickly ambush? I was so frightened by this horrifying thought that my mind became clouded by a fog, and I couldn't think straight, and so I remained very still, hoping that my assumptions were very wrong. All of a sudden, darting through the sagebrush was a female creature and her youngling, who was only about 2 feet tall and looked very mischievous and rather like a great big teddy bear. I could hear the excited chatter as they began to gather around each other and examine the string of Christmas lights excitedly. I'm almost certain they were speaking in a language, but it was so fast and animated, and it sounded almost like gibberish. I remember once seeing a documentary of Bushmen being shown water coming out of a tap for the very first time, and their expressions were so astonished and amazed. Well, I assure you, the expression on these creatures' face was very much the same, for it seemed the magic of those Christmas fairy lights had bedazzled and beguiled them, and they were awestruck. I could see the parents talking away happily as they discussed the lights in great detail. It seemed as if they had a whole lot to say about them, for their discussion went on and on and on, and they spoke together backwards and forwards, for ages and ages. Where had the little one got to, I wondered suddenly, for he seemed to have vanished into thin air. Suddenly I felt a presence behind me and looked around to see the 2-foot impish youngling staring at me with deep-set dark eyes that twinkled with a roguish playfulness. My heart sank, for if his parents were to discover me, I would indeed be in serious trouble, so I thought. I put my finger onto my lips and went, "Shh, shh," and the little critter copied me and did exactly the same. "Shh, shh." I could see the youngling's eyes were completely fixated by my dog tag that I wear around my neck, because it gleamed brightly, as it was made out of mother of pearl, which he seemed to find very eye-catching. It had been brought for me by my ex-wife as a fashion statement for our wedding, and on the back of the tag was the date that we got married. I only wore it because I loved the piece. I pulled it off and put it on the critter's neck, and the little youngling was completely absorbed by the necklace and looked at me with an animated, joyous expression on his face, almost as if he'd won the lottery. With relief I watched him join his parents, without alerting them to my presence. To my amazement, the big creature actually returned our Christmas lights to the tent and then promptly glided away. When I ambled back to the tent, I began to shake Rudolph wide awake. "Wake up, bro! Wake up! Wake up!" he groaned. "What's wrong?" I proceeded to tell him exactly what I'd seen, and he looked at me with astonishment on his face, his jaw dropping to the ground, and his eyes growing as wide as saucers. "You do know what you saw," he said. "No, of course I don't," I said. "You saw Bigfoot. Do you realise how lucky you are? You know how many people would do their nut to see what you've just seen. It's not fair," he said. "Why didn't you wake me up?" "You have no idea how big and scary he was," I said. "For a moment I did think I might end up being dinner." "If they meant to harm us," said Rudolph, "they would never have returned the Christmas lights or left us alone." I did realise that Rudolph was right, and it would seem the creatures did not intend to harm us at all, which was a monumental relief. We spent the rest of the weekend at the camping site, hiking, bird-watching, and talking, and Rudolph sat up all night, hoping for a sighting of the Bigfoot, but they never returned to our campsite, which caused Rudolph a great deal of disappointment. To cut a long story short, it's been over 5 years, and I haven't touched a single drop of alcohol, and neither has Rudolph. But in such a short space of time, so much has changed, as it invariably always does. For a start, Rudolph and I run an online business together, and things are looking promising for our futures, and we both love our work. Rudolph divorced his nagging wife, and we currently are both remarried to the most wonderful woman. I have decided to never touch drink again. I cannot trust myself to stop at just one beer. There are times when I think one would go down rather nicely with some barbecue spare ribs, but I'm not prepared to take that risk, as I have way too much to lose, and Rudolph feels exactly the same. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. "Tessa," called my mother, "there's someone on the telephone for you." It was in the 1980s, and I was 20 years old at the time. "Hello," I said, picking up the phone. "Who is this?" "It's me, Sue, silly. How do you fancy going out on a double date on Friday night? Go on, please say yes. It'll be heaps of fun." "With who?" I said. "Well, my boyfriend Joss has a friend called Hugo who's looking for a date. He's very handsome. You'll really like him." "Why me?" I asked. "Isn't there someone else you could take? You know how uncomfortable and awkward I am with strange people." "Oh, come on. Don't be such a spoilsport. I think the two of you would get on like a house on fire. Come on. It'll be fun. Please say yes. It'll be heaps of fun." "With who?" I said. "Well, my boyfriend Joss has a friend called Hugo who's looking for a date. He's very handsome. You'll really like him." "Why me?" I asked. "Isn't there someone else you could take? You know how uncomfortable and awkward I am with strange people." "Oh, come on. Don't be such a spoilsport. I think the two of you would get on like a house on fire. Come on. It'll be fun." And so it was, with a large degree of reluctance, coupled with great trepidation, I decided to go on this blind date. But I was secretly comforted by the knowledge that Sue and Josh would clearly have my back. I was naturally very shy and self-effacing by nature, but I knew I could rely on my friends to paddle the conversation along if things should become awkward. Hugo was a good-looking man, and I did find him attractive in a way, I suppose, but I did not like the way he was eyeing me with those hawk-like eyes. Even when I was tucking into my pizza, the young man continued to stare at me, and he was making no secret of it either. I could see that even Josh and Sue were becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and Sue was rolling her eyes at the back of her head, trying to encourage Josh to actually say something, because things were becoming pretty intense, and the ambience around the table increasingly strained. "Hugo, stop staring at the poor girl. You're making us all feel very uncomfortable. I know she's very pretty, but go on, eat your food." All of a sudden, Hugo suddenly snapped out of his trance-like state and actually apologised. "Oh, I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to stare." So things around the table became more relaxed and convivial, but I can't say that I really said much over dinner, and frankly I couldn't wait to get back home. I hated dinner parties like that. As far as I was concerned, the date had been catastrophic, and I hoped I'd never bump into that loser again, as he almost certainly gave me the creeps. I worked in a small town in rural Montana as a shop assistant in a clothing boutique, while I still lived at home with both of my parents, in their exquisitely beautiful country farmhouse, where I'd grown up as a girl, surrounded by verdant rolling countryside, mountainous valleys, and vast areas of extensive wood green. We had 2 barns on our property, a delightful silvery pond, a stable block and 4 horses, 4 cows and 3 rambunctious Labradors. We lived in quite a remote area, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. You could literally drive down some of those country roads, surrounded by high embankments and lined with trees, and not see a single car for many miles. I had 3 sisters, all whom were much younger than me, and I was the eldest. My father worked as a manager on a large dairy farm, whilst my mother stayed at home making jams, chutneys and fudge, and all that kind of stuff that she sold to a local delicatessens, and there was a high demand for her products. I'd been working at the boutique for about 8 months, and the owner Janice and I had become as thick as thieves. One morning Janice handed me a large box addressed to me, delivered from the florist. The box looked magnificent, and was covered with a ribbon, and a single red rose was wrapped inside some tissue paper, along with a card attached saying, "So enjoyed dinner the other night. Hope to see you very soon. All my love, Hugo." I cast the box to one side with a look of disgust on my face. "Oh no," I said, putting my hands on my head in a gesture of despair. "It's from the chap who stared at me like a goldfish all evening. You know the date I told you about that Sue organised. What was his name? Hugo, I think it was." "Oh, him," said Janice. "Oh dear, methinks you have made an impression on him," she teased. It was a beautiful summer's day, and I was helping an elderly woman who was trying on a turquoise dress for a wedding she was planning to attend, and I was trying to persuade her to buy it because it looked really good on her. "But what about the yellow dress?" she said. "I really like that one." "But I don't like it on you," I told her truthfully. "It really doesn't flatter your figure, and the colour is very draining on you." "Oh dear," said the old lady. "When I was a young girl, I had such a magnificent figure, but I just don't know what happened to it. Now I have to wear clothes to soften all the lumps and bumps, and I loathe it." "Nonsense," I said. "You look great, Miss Green. Don't be so hard on yourself." All of a sudden the bells to the shop jingled, and I looked up hopefully, expecting to see a brand new customer, but it was Hugo carrying a huge bouquet of flowers in his hands, when he'd only just delivered me a rose. I could see that Miss Green was staring at Hugo, with her mouth hanging wide open, as if she'd only just seen a ghost, and the abhorrent expression in her eyes was one of total and utter hatred. I could tell that Miss Green clearly looked on Hugo as an unsavoury, detestable, repugnant character, or should we say a lower form of pond life. "Hello, can I help you?" I said to Hugo, in a very nonchalant way, with an air of indifference, trying my level best to pretend that I didn't recognise him at all. I could see the corners of his lips drop down into a scowl, and a certain look of disappointment in his dark brown eyes. "Don't you remember me?" he asked. "We were on a double date together over a week ago with Sue and Josh at that lovely Italian restaurant down the road with the purple awning. You know the one. You had pizza." "Oh, that," I said, sounding dispassionate and really rather offhand and indifferent, as if he was referring to something so dull and tedious that it really wasn't worth mentioning at all. "These are for you," he said proudly, handing me a large bouquet of flowers. I thought pink and yellow roses would suit you." "Thank you, they're very beautiful," I said.
"I was wondering," he stammered, "if you would consider going out for dinner with me tomorrow night. There's a lovely new Italian in town, and the reports are that the food is excellent, and they have particularly good pizza, which I know you like."
I promptly thrust the bouquet back at Hugo. "Give those to your mother," I said. "I'm rarely flattered by your generous overtures, but I'm just not interested in you. Don't take it personally. I'm just not looking for a relationship, that's all." "You heard her, Hugo," said Mrs. Green, interceding. "Leave the poor girl alone. She's not interested in you at all." At that, Hugo threw the flowers over the shop, scattering the petals all around the floor, and he stormed out of the boutique with an aggrieved expression on his face. "Believe me, you got off lightly," said Miss Green. "That boy is a nasty piece of work. You want nothing to do with him." "How do you know him, Miss Green?" I asked. "Oh, I wish I didn't. He lives next door to me with his extended family, all whom are very agreeable people. But he turned out to be the rotten egg in the basket. Even his own mother once confided in me that she'd reached the end of her tether with Hugo. She told me she believed her own son was evil. Now for a mother to say that, that's something." "Isn't that a bit dramatic?" said Janice, interceding. "He most certainly did not look evil to me." "Looks can be very deceptive," said Miss Green. "Do you want to know why he's evil? I'll tell you why. One day when I was babysitting Liz's kids, now when I talk about Liz, I'm referring to Hugh's mother, which meant I had to look after Hugh as well. I believe at the time he was only 10 years old. I actually caught him trying to drown my own cat in the bathtub, and I'm not joking either." "You what?" I said, looking appalled. "That is seriously sick." After he failed to succeed in killing my cat, I then discovered he'd placed a plastic bag over my dog's head, and my poor dog was running around frantically, desperately trying to get the bag off, while Hugo just laughed. He found it all terribly amusing, and enjoyed seeing my dog's distress. I pulled the bag off my dog, and then thrust Hugo into my bathroom. He was kicking, screaming, protesting and biting me, and I just locked him up in there until Liz came back to collect her children. Naturally, I told her I didn't mind babysitting any of her other children, but I never wanted Hugo near my property again. Of course she understood. Over the years, I've had dog turd posted through my front door, deliveries of dead animals to my home, and even bricks flung into my window from time to time, and I know it's him. "Wow," I said. "I didn't even know people like that actually existed." "Don't be so naive, Tess," said Janice teasingly. "Of course there's evil in the world. Everything has its polar opposite. Surely you know that." In the weeks that followed, when I drove home from work late in the afternoon, I always observed this dark Honda travelling closely behind me, and it would pursue me night after night on parts of the road where cars barely ever travelled. Sometimes when I turned down the driveway into my own family farmhouse, this baleful Honda would just park outside the large cattle gate of my family premises and watch me drive down the long drive towards my house. The windows of the Jeep were so dark I couldn't see who the driver was, but I had a nauseating, sick, portentous and inauspicious feeling that the occupant of that Jeep was Hugo himself. In fact, I just knew that I knew it was him. The trouble is, when you're being deliberately shadowed down those long, remote, lonely country roads, it can be very alarming and discomposing. Many of my car journeys home had resulted in me breaking out in a cold sweat and hyperventilating, as that was how my fear just escalated. I had a very clear comprehension and understanding that Hugo was not right in the head, and it was clear to me that he had some kind of weird fixation over me that really needed to be nipped into the bud. I promptly decided to visit the sheriff to tell him what was happening to me, because that was how distressed I had become. I was not surprised to learn that Hugo was well known to the sheriff and had a rap sheet a mile long of assault with a deadly weapon, breaking and entering, and other misdemeanours. "Not a nice piece of work," the sheriff informed me. "Some people are just born that way." "Why don't you come with me, Tess, to the Warwick home?"
You can tell Hugo once and for all that you want nothing more to do with him, and I'll give him a big telling off on your behalf."
"Oh, I'm not sure about that, Sheriff. I don't think that's a good idea."
"Look," said the sheriff, "in my experience, when you face your stalker face to face, it's not a bad thing at all. You won't regret it," he assured me, and so I reluctantly agreed. Hugo lived in a large family home with many brothers and sisters, all who came running towards the sheriff's car as we finally parked in the driveway, and they seemed rather excited to see us. "Is Hugo in trouble again, Sheriff?" said the little boy, looking earnest. "In a manner of speaking," said the sheriff. "Is he home?" The little boy nodded, eyeing me curiously. "What's he done now?" said the mother, rubbing her floury hands on her apron. "Hugo," she called. "Hugo." "Sorry, Sheriff," she explained. "I'm in the middle of kneading dough." Then I saw him, and he stopped dead in his tracks on seeing me standing there next to the sheriff. "Tess has something she wants to say to you," said the sheriff. I was feeling rather awkward and began to tremble uncomfortably, as the kitchen was now filled with children in varying ages. All eyes were focused on me. "I came here today to ask you to leave me alone. Stop following me in my car. Leave me alone. I'm not interested in a relationship with you. Please get the message." "You heard her," said Hugo's mother, looking at Hugo with savage, angry eyes. "If you lay a hand on this girl, Hugo, you'll have me to deal with. Do you understand?" Hugo nodded his head. "Hugo, if you've been following Jess around at night in your car, it has to stop now. This is very serious indeed. And if you carry on in this way, conducting yourself like this inappropriately, you'll be locked up in a shoebox for the rest of your life, and I don't think you want that." I was beginning to feel as if a weight had been lifted, because I was no longer being stalked by Hugo. The stunt with the sheriff had really paid off. I really believed he'd finally got the message, and it would see my life return to normal. But things began to change when I started to date a new boy in town a couple of months later. I never saw anything physically, nor did I detect anyone following me back home at night in my white Mustang, but I sensed something was seriously off. It was on a Friday morning I woke up with a sickening, nauseating feeling in my gut. It was so overwhelming that I seriously considered just calling in sick. Yet I was by nature a diligent, very hard-working person, and I didn't fancy leaving poor Janice to do all the stock-taking alone in the boutique, as it was a laborious, thankless task that was likely to take most of the night. "What's wrong?" said Janice as we were going through the stock. "You look so subdued and quiet today, if you don't mind me saying so, and you look a little green in the face. You're not getting sick, are you?" "No," I said, "it's not that." As you can imagine, the stocktake was an unforgiving, thankless task, but luckily it was finally finished by about 10 at night. "Take the morning off," said Janice. "You've outdone yourself this evening. Well done." I was exhausted and grabbed a coffee to go, and quickly got back into my car. And as I was driving down some of those precipitous country roads, I noticed that not too far behind me was a bright red Ford Escort, which I did think was strange at this time of the night, as I always found the roads unusually quiet. I did not give the matter any further thought until my car started to stall, and then came to a grinding stop. My petrol tank was empty, but I mean, how was that possible? I'd filled the tank earlier on in the morning. Thankfully, I could see the red Ford Escort stop behind my Mustang in my rear mirror, and I felt heartily relieved that I was likely to get some help from a generous Samaritan. Well, so I thought. "Do you need some help?" came the voice. "Yes, please," I said. "I've run out of petrol." Imagine my horror when I found myself standing face to face with Hugo. I could detect the strong smell of whiskey on his breath, and his brown eyes looked very intense. What are you doing here?" I stuttered. "You need to stop playing games with me," said Hugo. "Stop playing so hard to get. You know you really want me." I'm not playing any games with you, I said. Anyway, I have a boyfriend. And what's he got that I haven't got? Asked Hugo. Do you think I'm just going to sit back, seeing you with another man, and do nothing about it? Ha! Do you think I'm such a complete idiot? I could see the anger rising up in Hugo's face, and it alarmed and frightened me. Worse still, he began fiddling at the halter on the side of his jeans, and I suddenly realised the precariousness of my situation, because this unhinged young man would think nothing of putting a bullet through my head. So without hesitation, I began to run over the embankment through the woodland trees, having little clue as to where I was going, but luckily the light of an almost full moon made my escape a little easier. I could hear Hugo's leather boots following me, and they appeared to be moving faster and faster, gaining more traction and speed, and getting way too close for comfort. "Come back, you bitch!" screamed Hugo. "I'll kill you! Do you get that? I'll kill you, girl!" My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and the adrenaline coursing through my veins at a rapid speed, but it did seem to give me an edge. Before long I found myself in a very beautiful sylvan, with tall statuesque trees and open trails. I looked around frantically, as I could hear Hugo coming close behind me, and I had no idea where the heck to hide. I had only seconds to find a place, so I dashed up to a rocky outcrop, surrounded by some high brush, and began to buckle down to the undergrowth, praying to God that he would never see me. I realised to my horror that Hugo had a flashlight with him, and was shining it all over the pine forest. For some reason he knew I was hiding very close by. I held my breath, terrified that even my breathing could alert him to my presence. I could hear my heart vibrating through my chest, and my whole body was quite literally shaking in terror. "I know you're here," he said. "You think everything is a big game, don't you? Girls like you always do. You think you can get away with teasing a man without any repercussions. It doesn't work that way. You need sorting out, girl. And I think a bullet to your head is what is called for. I'm not going to sit back and watch you date other men. You turned me down, and then you go out with other men. If I can't have you, then no one can." I lay down in the brush as quietly as I could, and then I suddenly heard these heavy feet walking past me, and I nearly had a heart attack, because I thought it was Hugo. He was way too close for comfort. He was bound to see me. I looked up through the grass warily, and realised in astonishment that I was staring at something the likes of such that I've never seen before. And whatever it was, this thing was staring back at me with a look of extreme astonishment on his face, as if to say, "What the heck are you doing lying crouched in the shrubbery like that?" The creature was built like a strapping giant, towering at about 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, with a cone-shaped head that folded seamlessly into his shoulders. In my opinion, he looked like a giant wild man. I could sense he had a male energy, but his powerful muscular body was so covered in long flowing hair that I could not discern his sexuality. The creature glanced down at me, and in the moonlight I could see that it had kind eyes, which was very reassuring. In that second our eyes met, and in an unconscious way I truly believe he discerned my trouble and fear, because after I had looked at him, he then glanced towards the woods. He really rather reminded me of the moment when a dog's ears suddenly perk up, when they've heard an intruder or sensed something. I quickly pointed towards the woods and whispered, "He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. Please help me." I could hear Hugo stamping the ground with a timber stick. "When I get you, Tess, you're dead, and I'll find you." I watched as this curious anomalous creature cautiously glided from one pine tree to another, with the stealth, grace and fluidness of a cheetah. Finally he peered around the broken trunk of a sizable western cedar tree and peeped at Hugo. The critter then threw a stone at him to attract his attention and to elicit some kind of response,
and he wasn't disappointed.
"You think this is funny, Tess?" he shouted. "I told you you're a big tease."
He darted towards the trees to grab what he thought must be me, but instead he found himself holding on to this monstrous-sized beast. I could see Hugo trembling as he let go of the beast with a look of total astonishment on his face, and he lost his balance, falling backwards on the ground, landing on his derriere, and fiddling desperately with his holty to retrieve his revolver. His dismayed eyes were as round as saucers, and the expression on his face was just consumed with terror. And yet, despite his rising level of trepidation, with trembling hands, Hugo still managed to fire several shots at the critter, but all his bullets missed their target. I think Hugo's futile attempts at firing at this strange creature was a monumental mistake on his part, for it grabbed his revolver and flung it on the top of this twisted mountain juniper tree, where it remained on the very top of a gnarled branch, shaped rather like an open shelf, at about 50 feet off the ground, and on his face he wore a look of disgusted revulsion. I watched as the Herculean wild man began to pound his chest, as if to show who was boss, in an act of defiance, and then with a furious growl that was so terrifying that it caused the ground to reverberate, I realised that Hugo was now in the creature's hands. "Please don't hurt me," begged Hugo. But his desperate words were lost on the creature, as he was flung in the air, up and down like a frisbee. Hugo looked so pathetic and tiny in this creature's arms, and I could hear him screaming, "Help! Help! Someone help!" The creature took absolutely no notice, and to my horror, he simply whacked Hugo's body against the tree trunk, and then I could see his arms go limp. The wild man trotted over to me and pointed towards Hugo's dead body. It was lying there sprawled on the ground, as if to say, "I've sorted out your problem," and then he looked at me with his kind eyes and was gone from my sight. I ran over to Hugo's dead body just to check that he really was gone, and it looked as if his body had been truly whacked, as some of his bones were plunging through the flesh, and part of the flesh had burst open. I began to cry. I felt responsible for what had happened, and was quick to forget that if it had not been for that mysterious wild man, I would be the one that would be dead. I ran towards the road, using Hugo's flashlight to see clearly. I was panting heavily and sweating profusely. I ran over to Hugo's car and opened the door with ease, and discovered a petrol decanter full of petrol on the back seat. I grabbed it, filled my car with petrol, and got the hell out of there. I did not tell anybody what had transpired, except for Janice, of course, who told me to keep my mouth shut and not to say a word to anyone. "You don't want to be drawn into an investigation," she said. "Just say nothing." Hugo's body was recovered in 12 hours, as the police had found his mother's red Escort empty, and had learnt from her that Hugo had not returned home the previous night, and so they searched the area thoroughly and found his body, and were completely perturbed as to what on earth had happened to him, as I gather the police had never seen anything like it before, but the death was put down as an attack by a bear. It would seem no one in our town missed Hugo, and the sheriff actually paid me a surprise visit. "Tess, I know you know more about this gruesome business with Hugo," he said. I looked at him in astonishment, my eyes now filling with tears. "How do you know, Sheriff?" I asked. "Call it a hunch," he said, looking at me kindly. "Do you want me to tell you exactly what happened?" I asked. "Not necessary, Tess. The case is now closed. The town is a whole lot safer without Hugo Warwick, and I believe lives have already been saved." "What do you mean, Sheriff?" I asked. "Well, sooner or later a man like that was going to kill someone. Even his mother said so. The trouble is, one killing leads to another. It gets easier every time for the likes of people like Hugo. You don't want someone like that around. But I didn't have good reason to arrest him. All that happened a long time ago, and I believe the wild man I encountered was a Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story." Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I will never ever forget the sombre, dingy and subdued dark day of my dad's funeral. Even the weather did not smile, as the blue sky was dramatically eclipsed by a smouldering darkness that blanketed and enveloped it in a foreboding telltale sign that told us that a storm was brewing. My emotions were far too numb to even feel anything at all, for the shock of my dad's sudden passing had left my stomach twisted in knots and my thoughts confiscated by both denial and disbelief. I watched my poor mother's heartbroken, sorrowful face throw white lilies on top of his wooden coffin into the open grave, while everyone clustered around the site like a flock of penguins to bid their final farewells to my beloved father. They mopped away tears from their faces with large handkerchiefs, while they gathered under the wide-brimmed parasols of their umbrellas as it bucketed down with rain. For it seemed that even the full clouds in the oppressive dark sky could not contain their tears of sadness, for a great soul had indeed left our world. As you can imagine, no one had expected my father to die so suddenly and fortuitously, so it would seem that his abrupt, unpredicted demise had hit us like a cruel blow in the lower guts. What had started as a rather fun day out turned out to be the worst, most harrowing, traumatic day of my life, for I was completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. It was a beautiful spring day in New York, and after an invigorating walk in the verdant green park, full of dog walkers and joggers, our family of 4 had visited a diner on the east side of Manhattan in New York, which abuts the East River facing Brooklyn and Queens. We had learnt that this particular diner had one of New York's best pizza slices, and my father considered himself a connoisseur when it came to deciding whether a pizza had the perfect amount of crispness from the base, sweetness and saltiness from the tomato sauce, and wasn't dominated by an excess of cheese. The high-spirited hip diner smelt of melted cheese, garlic and olive oil, and the delicious smell enveloped the air, causing my stomach to rumble hungrily. On this occasion the diner had an even more energetic, animated ambience than usual, and people were buzzing around the place like bees around a honeypot, armed with delectable pizza slices dribbling with stringy mozzarella, and glasses of white wine. It looked as if they were preparing to watch an exciting show, and it seemed I wasn't wrong in my brief assessment.
"What is all this fuss about?" my father asked the manager. "It's very lively in here. What's going on?" "I know," said the manager. "We have quite a party here this afternoon. It's the pizza eating competition," he informed us proudly. "We promote it every year. If you can manage to eat a massive, huge pizza that could feed 12 people under 30 minutes, you will have pride of place on our Hall of Fame," he said, pointing to the photographs on the wood-panelled wall of previous winners, all smiling gleefully into the camera. "You can win $100, a T-shirt and a free pizza for life at our diner. The question is, are you up to the challenge?" he asked my father. "You look like a man who has an eye for adventure. Go on, I dare you. Give it a go. We do need more contestants." My father was about 6'3", lanky and lean, but he also enjoyed eating and had always loved his food, most especially Italian. "I'll give it a go," he said. "Why not? How hard can it be? Besides, I am getting rather hungry." "Good for you," said the manager. "Really, Dad?" I said excitedly. "Are you really going to enter?" "Why not?" my father said. "It'll be fun." "I'm not sure it's a good idea, sweetheart," said my mother, looking worried. "You're up against people who do this kind of thing for big money. You're a novice." "Sweetheart," said my father, kissing my mother lovingly on the cheek. "It's only a pizza-eating competition, for goodness sake. I'm not about to attempt a tightrope on the Empire State Building. How much harm can it do? It's only a bit of fun." I think there were 7 people in the competition, each being presented a pizza the size of a small tabletop.
And when the bell rang, they began to dive into their pizzas with haste, while the effervescent, vivacious people of the diner were egging them on excitedly, and the cheering from the enthusiastic crowd really encouraged the eaters to get stuck into their pizzas with haste. I noticed that some of the contestants barely even bothered to chew their food, but swallowed it down with copious amounts of water as quickly as they could, as it was some kind of technique. My father was trying his level best to compete with some of these professionals, and he really began to struggle and beaver away at his pizza, taking large bites and chewing them as fast as he could. But even though he was lagging behind the other contestants, he wasn't about to lose heart. "Go on, Dad," my brother and I shouted encouragingly. "You know you can do it. We have faith in you." The crowd was so motivating that my father just didn't want to give up. Finally, he had enough. He looked as if he was blue in the face and got up and pushed the pizza away from him, and then suddenly he passed out and collapsed on the floor. In moments, the emergency services arrived hurriedly on the scene and tried their level best to unblock all the pizza dough caught up in my father's throat by using the Heineck maneuver and other techniques, one that involved cutting an airway with a knife. But by the time we got to the hospital, the ambulance had pronounced him dead. It seemed that despite their best efforts, his air passage was so heavily blocked with dough it had become like superglue and wedged in his passageway, and he had lost consciousness in his struggle to breathe. It was a devastating, catastrophic loss for the all of us. I was completely astonished that a pizza-eating competition could result in my dad's sudden passing away, and never in a million years would I have envisaged losing him over a pizza, but stranger things have happened in our lives. We had to buckle up and get on with life, but I'm not going to pretend it was easy for any of us, because it most certainly wasn't. Life without my father was gruelingly hard, but with a life insurance policy behind her, my mother was able to continue to send us to good schools and to buy the apartment where we lived in New York. One day my mother told me that she was getting married and that she had a new mystery man in her life whom she would introduce us to over dinner that night. I wish I could say I was pleased for her, but I was completely gutted, as I couldn't bear the idea of my father being replaced, which is only natural for a son to feel that way. "I've been feeling very lonely and forsaken," my mother told us. "You kids are my world, but what happens when you finally leave home and I'm left all on my own? I'll feel so alone, desolate and abandoned, which is more than I can bear." "I understand, Mum," I said, taking her lovingly in my arms. I think I do, but it's so hard to imagine you with someone else other than Dad." "Look, sweetheart," said my mother, looking at me intently, and then at my brother William. "You boys need to know that no one in this world will ever replace your father. Do you understand that? He was the love of my life. No one else will ever be able to measure up to him. Besides, let's face it, God broke the mould when he made your father. There's no one out there like him at all. I bet he's up in heaven, having a huge laugh about choking on a pizza and dying as a result. You know your father. He always saw the funny side of everything." "Well, why do you have to marry this man?" said William sulkily. "You don't love him, do you?" "Love him? Heavens, no," said my mother. "But I am very fond of him, and I like him quite a lot, and that is a good start. It's a promising foundation for a future. At this stage of my life, I'm really just looking for friendship, security and love. I told you, I don't want to be alone. It really is that simple. I think I'm really rather afraid of loneliness, and I do know that your father would understand my dilemma. He would never begrudge me some happiness. You know that." "Of course we do. But has this man ever been married before?" I asked. "His name is Chris Tedder, and yes, Simon, he has been married before. 5 times, actually. I'll be the 6th wife, which is a bit of a sobering thought, I have to admit." "5 times, Mum," I said, gasping. "Are you kidding, Mum? What on earth are you thinking? Have you completely lost leave of your senses?"
Sorry, Mum, no offence, but this needs to be said, and the truth can be hard to take, but it needs saying. You can't just marry someone who's been married that many times before. You're asking for trouble. What happened to all his previous wives?
Simon, you're just like your father. Look at you, so overprotective and nurturing. And I really appreciate that you care. Really I do. But I need you boys to support me tonight. I need you to have my back. We're going to a Mexican restaurant in town. It, I gather, has a good reputation. And I want the two of you to be very, very nice to Chris. Do you understand? We both nodded in agreement. So there we were, sitting at a large table in a Mexican restaurant in East Manhattan with a buzzing hip vibe. We were waiting for Chris to arrive, and then we saw him. My first impression of him was not good, because he was grinning from ear to ear with his white gleaming gnashes as he approached the table, which really was rather full on for my liking. Should he not be a little more restrained when approaching the children of his future wife for the very first time? Chris was about 6'4", with a scattering of thin brown hair and unlined face with pale blue shifty-looking eyes, and he was wearing a pair of blue jeans and a loose white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. I suppose he wasn't too bad looking, but he wasn't even remotely like my father. Not that that was a bad thing, of course, but I didn't understand the attraction on my mother's part. As far as I could see, he wasn't much of a catch. My mother could have done so much better. That's what I thought privately to myself. Chris took my hand to shake it. "Pleased to meet you, Simon. I've heard all about you from your mother." I held his limp, clammy hand in mine, and that was a bright red flag for me. Did his weak, pathetic handshake reveal how insipid, wishy-washy and bland a character he really was beneath the surface, I secretly wondered. I watched as he sat down next to my mother, kissing and slobbering her tenderly on the cheek, and keeping his arms tightly pinned over her shoulders as if he was guarding her, which I found disturbing. I didn't like a stranger's arm dangling around my mother. It really was rather unsettling and discomposing. "So, Chris," I said, "my mother tells me you've been married 5 times. Is that right?" My mother was virtually pleading me with her earnest eye movements to stop this manner of awkward questioning because it was very embarrassing for her, but I didn't care. If I made this man squirm like an octopus in a bucket, well, so be it. I was going to get him pumping out black ink by the time the evening was over. I felt certain about that. "Your mother informs you well," said Chris. "I was very young in those early marriages of mine. I chose women that did not complement my personality. But things are very different now, and these days I'm much more discerning and far less naive, which is why your mother has so graciously accepted my proposal of marriage and has made me a very happy man indeed." "Is that so?" I said, with an air of sarcasm. "You make marriage sound like you're investing in a piece of furniture. My mother is not a piece of furniture. She's not for sale." Chris laughed. "You have a comical son here, Caroline," he said jokingly. But I could see his eyes looked exceedingly annoyed. All of a sudden, an attractive waitress arrived at our table, with long dark auburn hair and bright blue eyes, and I did notice Chris giving her an approving once-over, which made me cringe inside with disgust. The young woman began to take everybody's orders down, and then the conversation meandered away, drifting on to other topics, but there were moments that I did observe Chris glancing at me warily, as if to say, "I can see that I've a difficult boy here to deal with." I think he could almost potentially smell the problems that I might bring to their future relationship. Good, I thought. "Do you have any children, Chris?" I asked. Yes, as it happens I do. I have 2 daughters and a son, and they live in Portugal. I never get to see them," he said. "You never told me you had any children," said my mother, looking at Chris with a very disheartened expression on her face. "You should have told me. That was very important." "Perhaps you shouldn't be rushing into marriage," I suggested gleefully. It seems like there's not much you know about each other yet, I said sarcastically, as I couldn't resist the urge to dig. I wasn't nice, I'm afraid. Now, Simon, there's no need to dig the knife in so hard, my mother scolded. I do apologise, Chris. Simon is very rude and very tactless, I'm afraid. Well, Simon, I do happen to understand where you're coming from. I know it can't be easy to see your mother with another man after your dad's tragic passing. Yes, I acknowledge that your mother and I do not know a lot about each other. But that will change as we grow together in a loving marriage. But I know that our relationship will be a voyage of discovery. And by the way things are going, it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful adventure for the both of us, he said, reaching for my mother's hand and squeezing it tightly. I wanted to throw up, I really did. And judging by William's expression, he felt as nauseous as I did. We gave each other furtive glances, and William gave me a sizable eye roll. In a private moment together, we discussed our mother's newfound love. I tried not to observe Chris through your prejudicial eyes, said William, because let's face it, you're so overprotective over mother. I didn't think that you were ever going to like this man, even if he had been a saint. But a saint he is not. I have to admit there's something about Chris that gives me the creeps and makes my skin crawl. I think we need to find out more about Chris before he walks down the aisle with Mother. Dad would expect us to watch her back. You know how naive and trusting she can be. We have to protect her for her own good. We have to make sure she doesn't make a grievous mistake. There's something very dodgy and nefarious about this man. I feel it in my gut. Me too, I agreed. And so it was my brother and I worked tirelessly to find out everything we could about Chris Tedder. And from what we'd established, he was indeed a serial womanizer, whose marriages had failed and all but ended as a result of adulterous affairs, and the wives, of course, having found out about Chris's perfidious and unchaste moonlighting with other women. I was certain my mother had no knowledge of his previous philandering exploits, and was under the false, misguided impression that Chris's marriages had irretrievably broken down as a result of having so little in common with his wives, but that was very clearly not the case. My brother and I spoke to 3 of his ex-wives, and none of them had a single good word to say about him, and were virtually spitting like vipers at the mere mention of his name. We were told he was a traitorous, wayward, cheating, lying, weak man. We were soon to establish that my mother was planning to marry a man who simply couldn't keep his hands off other women. We were very fortunate to take video footage of him touching up young girls so inappropriately at bars and clubs who were young enough to be his own daughters. He was flirting and chatting them up while he claimed to my mother that he was out entertaining clients to dinner on a business capacity. Seeing him wolfing around like this made my brother and I literally want to vomit. Our plan was to present Chris with the evidence of his philandering misdemeanours, so he could end things with my mother very cordially and swiftly, without any hard feelings or upset. Otherwise we would show her the video footage we had uncovered about him. So yes, we were blackmailing him for the greater good, by saving my mother from this deplorable wretch, whose only interest was in pleasing and satisfying his own perverse appetites. A day later my mother announced to us that we were all going on a camping holiday together, as a prelude before officially we became a family, and Chris and her finally ran off into the sunset just to tie the knot on a tropical island somewhere. I think it'll be a great idea for you boys to get to know Chris a lot better, as he will be moving in with us after I get married to him. I think we should break the ice first before that happens, so I thought hiking, barbecuing and a bit of fishing together will be very bonding for all of us, and I'm sure you'll get to love Chris. He's a good man, so please give him a chance. I know he's not your father, but try to be nice to him, just for my sake, she begged us. Well, where are we going? I asked. We're flying to West Virginia tomorrow. It's a very short 1-20-minute flight, and then we're going to hire a jeep, and we're going to drive to Cumberbow State Forest in Randolph County, where we've hired a cabin for a few nights. Sounds lovely, I said, trying to sound enthusiastic, although my heart was sinking at the very idea of seeing Chris again. But I did look forward to showing him the video evidence of his philandering and flirtatious ways, and I hoped that we would see the end of this complete moron for good. Before long we were driving down a gravel road in the Jeep that we'd hired that led to one of the primitive pioneer log cabins where everything was made from very dark stained sawed lumber, with the exception of a traditional stone fireplace. The Arcadian wooden walls and ceilings were graced with gas lanterns, and there was an intimate wood-burning stove, and it really gave the cabin a cosy, warm, organic feeling which you do not get in conventional homes. And the rustic, home-style mellow appearance and simplicity of the decor really did give us a taste of life in those bygone days when in 1650 the British pioneers had established a solid base here in West Virginia. The Arcadian cabin was situated in the middle of the woods, surrounded by gorgeous statuesque spruce and hemlock trees, and there were crystal-clear streams strewn with sculptural boulders that meandered through the valley. It was mesmerizingly pretty, and we had spotted numerous deer scampering around the countryside, and even a couple of brown bears foraging for berries on the side of the precipitous dirt road. For the first couple of days, my brother and I were on our best behaviour. We would go hiking with Chris and my mother on some rather precarious, narrow, overgrown trails, and were able to enjoy breathtaking, beguiling views of statuesque mountains, rugged outcrops, flowering meadows, and resplendent waterfalls, where streams of white foaming water blasted over the rocks with forceful jets, and the gentle spray vaporized over our faces in a misty dew. We also thoroughly enjoyed a spot of very successful trout fishing at the Crystal Lake, and we walked away with some sizable-looking trout, which we grilled at night over the fire pit, and the taste of that melt-in-the-mouth flaky fish served with butter and garlic was absolutely awesome. In the evenings we enjoyed delicious dinners eaten over the fire pit, as everything eaten outdoors is always infinitely more delicious. We talked and laughed over beers, or in my mother's case her drink of choice was ice-cold white wine. We enjoyed the beauty of stargazing at night, and of course listening to the sounds of the crickets and frogs, and we could also hear the distant calls and howls of coyotes. It was different to the city noises of New York, and the traffic and beeping taxicabs that we were so used to. Over this period of time we had watched Chris with beady, very discerning eyes, and it hadn't escaped our attention that he would sometimes make his excuses and disappear into a private spot and tap away at his phone, and his furtive behaviour caused my heckles to rise, as I knew that it was more than likely he was texting other women, and such a thought made me sick to my stomach. Despite everything, my brother and I were determined to make our holiday pleasant before we finally approached Chris with all the evidence. "I'm so glad you boys are beginning to come around to liking Chris," my mother said. "If that's what you call it, Mum," I said sarcastically. "I don't like the man, and neither does William, but we are being pleasant for your sake." Oh dear, said my mother. "I really don't like the sound of that at all. I'm getting married to him soon, boys. You're going to have to try harder to get on with him." And so it was on the final night of our stay at the National Forest. After dinner we decided to do a spot of night fishing with Chris, and so armed with our fishing tackle, along with our headlamps, we ambled down some narrow paths until we found ourselves at the lake, where we set up our rods. It was an exquisitely beautiful night, where the bright ivory full moon illuminated the sky, and the reflections of the vase-shaped trees and mountainous ridges danced on the surface of the silvery lake, while the night was serenaded by the sounds of frogs and crickets. We all cast out our rods and opened some icy-cold beers to drink. My heart was thundering in my chest, and I promptly said, "Chris, William and I do not want you to marry our mother, as you will only break her heart, and we love our mother too much, and so we need to protect her from you."
"What are you talking about?" said Chris, looking aggrieved. "Your mother and I love each other. Why are you so hell-bent on ruining our lives for us?"
William interceded. "We know why your previous marriages ended in disaster and failed. You cheated on every single one of your wives. Now that's disgusting." Chris stumbled on his words.
You You got that all wrong. If that's what my exes told you, they're all lying through their teeth. They just want to get their back on me for leaving them. They don't handle rejection well. You know how vengeful women can be. They can be very vindictive. What's the saying? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
I very much doubt that your wives are all lying, I said, staring directly in Chris's eyes, and noticing that he failed to hold my gaze, and promptly looked away. Do you know that not one of your ex-wives had a good word to say about you, Chris? Not a single good word. Now that's quite revelatory, don't you think?
So that's it. You're just going to tell your mother that my exes all hate me because I cheated on them. Is that all you've got on me? That's not very promising. I'll just tell your mother that it's all a lie, every single word of it. Oh, there is more, Chris, I said. Much, much more. And at that I pulled out my cell phone and proudly showed him the evidence of his roaming hands, groping young woman. Chris's face went as white as a ghost, and he looked mortified. Where did you get this from? He said, trying to grab my phone from me. At that a scuffle began, as Chris began to tackle me for the phone, and I suddenly realised his intention was to throw it in the lake to eliminate all the evidence. In seconds a brawl began between the two of us, and so I ran away as fast as I could through the wood green, with Chris hot on my trail. My brother just stood back watching the commotion, with a look of horror on his face. All I remember is sprinting away from that lake as fast as I could as the adrenaline surged through my system. I quickly hid the phone under a nearby rock, because that's exactly what Chris was after. The next thing I knew was that Chris was on top of me and had me pinned to the ground like a lion tackling its prey. He began punching me so hard, and the pain that exploded through my body was excruciating. The next thing I knew, he was hammering my head against the rock. "Where is your cell phone?" he screamed. "Where is it? Give it to me now. Where is it?" "I've hidden it," I told him proudly. At this his jaw tightened and his face grew crimson with rage, and he began to beat my head against the rock, and I was blindly aware that if he throttled me any harder, he might succeed in killing me, and a horrifying thought wafted in my mind like an unpleasant odorous smell. Supposing that was his intention all along, Chris could kill me and my brother and make out that we had drowned during the fishing. I wouldn't put anything past that duplicitous, guileful man, who was capable of anything nefarious as far as I was concerned. My thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the most discomposing, terrifying growl that was so petrifying that we immediately stopped fighting and looked up to find ourselves staring into the face of a belligerent, very disgruntled Bigfoot. I was dumbfounded and astonished. I'd never envisaged that Bigfoot was anything other than a creature of fiction. But now I was within touching distance of this incongruous, majestic, masterful and lofty beast. And being in his presence was like being up and close and personal with a wild lion. I cannot remember a time in my life that I was more terrified. The light of the head torch made me see the creature very clearly. He was easily over 10 foot tall, and was standing over us, staring at us with deep-set dark eyes that seemed to sear through us almost as if he was reading our very souls. The creature's breathing was very heavy, and I could smell his warm breath, which was strangely unoffensive, as was his body odour, which rather was like sweat mixed with the woody, citrusy notes of pine, and not like the sulphurous rank smells that are so often described on other Bigfoot encounters. The creature was covered from head to toe with long flowing hair, which appeared matted in various places. The torso area on his body was very pronounced. He was thick-set and burly, and the shoulders were excessively large, while the overlong arms and legs were strong but lean and lanky. The creature had a very distinguished pyramid-shaped head with a pointed tip that could literally swivel from left to right like an owl, and a very human-like face with a prominent brow ridge that was heavily wrinkled, and a very flat, firm nose. As we raised ourselves off the ground, we both ran backwards.
But the Bigfoot's eyes were not pinned on me. They were pinned on Chris. And it was as if something about him enraged him so much and ruffled his feathers. The only way I can describe it to you is that the Bigfoot expressed an extreme dislike and almost revulsion towards Chris. He made a beeline for the man, grabbing him in his strong, powerful hands. And Chris began to scream and scream at the top of his lungs, while the creature let out the most horrifying growl that sent shivers of dread down my spine and caused my skin to break out in goosebumps, and I began to convulse with terror like a jelly. The next thing I knew was that the creature ran off with Chris dangling over his shoulders into the woods and towards the lake. And then I heard the sound of water splashing, and I realised that the Bigfoot had offloaded Chris into the lake. I bolted as fast as I could through the woods down the hiking trail towards the lake, and that was where I saw the Bigfoot standing on the grassy embankment, swaying the branch of a spruce tree backwards and forwards, watching the body of Chris floating with his head under the water and blood pooling around it. I realised that Chris almost certainly was dead, and in truth I felt nothing. No regret, no disappointment, no guilt, just nothing. The creature looked satisfied by the sight of Chris's body being swept away by what seemed like a feisty current, as the wind had increased in intensity, and glanced up at me and looked at me with the kindest, warmest eyes I've ever seen. Yet moments before, he had been brutally savage towards Chris. I can only assume he considered Chris to be like a bad egg, and let's face it, he really was. Perhaps he'd picked up the dark, negative energy and was eager to dispose of it. To cut a long story short, the coroner put down Chris's death as an accidental drowning due to hitting his head hard on a rock and becoming disorientated and concussed. Of course, I knew what really had happened, but I was heartily relieved I didn't have the evidence to show my mother about Chris's philandering ways, as the less she knew about what had really happened, the better. Ironically, after Chris's death, my mother didn't appear too distressed, which really surprised me. She finally did get to marry a wonderful man 5 years after that, and she privately confided in me once that she was so relieved she never ended up marrying Chris Tedder. There was something about him that was rarely off, she told me. Little did she realise how on the money she was. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was in the early fall of 1981, when all the dogwoods had turned a glorious bright red, the sugar maples a burnt orange, the hickories and poplars had turned a yellow gold, while the sourwoods and sweet gums had taken on a crimson blush. Truly, there are no words to describe the artist's palette of rich, profusive colours that had anointed the leaves in such a glorious showy ensemble this season, which was far more opulent and grandiose than the resplendent robes worn by kings and queens from bygone generations, for indeed Mother Nature's rich jewels are without price. On such a magnificent, radiant day, I was fortunate enough to be riding down some of those extraordinary rugged back roads and horse-riding trails in the Kentucky countryside, on the back of my exquisitely beautiful American quarter house. I was totally mesmerised by the beguiling magnificence of the gorgeous scenic vistas, and it was particularly pleasant as the hot summer temperatures had dropped quite significantly, and so Snowdrop and I were having a very pleasurable ride. As I reached the right turning in the road, I didn't turn right again, which I normally would have done on my regular route home. Instead, I trotted forward, past our cattle gate, signposted the Lady's Manor, which was the name of our farm. The entrance gate sprawled out into a long sweeping driveway lined with mature oak trees that finally would lead to our farmhouse, but I wasn't going that way yet. On this occasion, even Snowdrop was confused, so I moved her in a small semicircle and used my feet and reins to nudge her to trot straight ahead, towards our neighbour's farm. I wanted to see if anyone had moved in yet, as the neglected, dilapidated farmhouse had stood abandoned and had been up for sale for rather a long time. I guess I wasn't surprised that it had not sold at once, even though the property itself was situated on an attractive prime piece of very desirable real estate. But it would seem the ramshackle farmhouse, along with the shabby barns and crumbling run-down stable blocks, were in a bad state of repair and had been falling apart due to years of neglect, which had caused a significant amount of damage, rot and damp, and had possibly put off prospective buyers from purchasing the farmhouse, as everything would need to be fixed up and thoroughly restored to tip-top condition, and that invariably did not come cheap. I was amazed because I could hear banging sounds and observe workers wearing bright yellow helmets, plaid shirts and shabby jeans, carrying lumber over their shoulders, sawing timber beams and hammering nails into wood. And I realised that they were restoring the old bedraggled farmhouse to bring it back to its former glory. I now knew without a shadow of a doubt that we would have a brand new neighbour gracing our neck of the woods any time soon. For I could see a sold sign had been slammed into the ground and stood up proudly and erect by the side of the gate, while the for sale sign had been taken down and was lying in a builder's dumpster along with plaster, old bricks, cement, tiles and other debris. This was good news indeed, I thought secretly to myself. Truly, I hoped that the neighbour would have children my own age, as being 13 years old and an only child was not at all easy, especially when you didn't have anyone your own age to play with, and being homeschooled by my mother on the farm meant that friends were invariably in short supply, and a rather valuable commodity for the likes of someone like myself. I galloped back to our farm, more than a little eager to tell my parents what I'd observed, as I knew that they would be very pleased that someone had seen the incredible potential of that charming property that only required some TLC to bring it back to speed. My family lived in a symmetrical farmhouse that was oozing an abundance of character and charm, and had a Cape Cod-style look about it, only it wasn't that style because it was a double-storey. We also gained great pleasure and appreciation watching the indigenous wildlife scampering across the property in the early morning when the sun began to rise, or early evening when the sun set over the valley in a resplendent array of tangerines and golds. These wild animals would frequent our pond for a much-needed drink, and we would sit back on the wooden deck, armed with our binoculars and a drink, and watch the wildlife. On occasions we'd actually seen cougars, bears, and what I'm certain was some kind of a large black panther cat. It was at the end of the fall, when the temperatures had dropped quite considerably, and the trees had lost all their leaves, while much of our grassland had taken on that dull yellow tone, when finally the new neighbours moved next door, and my mother invited them over to lunch. Our next-door neighbour was a woman in her late 60s called Uma, along with her grandchild Luke. I noticed she dyed her hair bright blonde, and was meticulously turned out in a smart 3/4-length tartan black watch skirt, which she wore with a white top and a frilly collar, a dark green cardigan, and a very large cameo brooch, along with a very delicate string of pearls. I could see she seemed rather bashful and reticent, but I didn't get the impression she was naturally shy, self-effacing, or even timid by nature. On the contrary, underneath the mask she put forward, I sensed lay a very effusive, rather gregarious woman that was trying her level best to restrain herself from bursting forward with some interesting dialogue. The only way I can describe it to you is that she seemed deliberately to be pulling the reins in and muzzling herself as far as her conversation was concerned, and appeared rarely guarded and intentionally subservient. We were always given the brush-off if we began to ask her too many questions. "It's so very kind of you to invite us around for lunch," she said. "Only a pleasure," said my mother. "We're so glad that someone has finally decided to buy the old Glover place. I must say, it looks incredible. You've literally transformed that farmhouse, and so quickly too. I'm incredibly impressed." "Thank you," said Irma. "That means an awful lot. It has been a lot of hard work, but I must say it's been worth every penny. It is a gorgeous property and a great investment." "Oh, I agree," said my mother. "I commend you for seeing its potential. But are you going to manage that farm all on your own?" asked my mother, handing her the large bowl of salad to accompany her lasagna. "If you don't mind me saying, it's a lot of work for one person." Irma took the salad bowl from my mother and started to pile some salad on her plate. I used to live on a farm in the Pacific Northwest, and granted, I'm not as young as I used to be, but there's still life in this old body yet, and I'm not adverse to a good bit of physical work. It's good for the soul, that's what my mother always used to say. Oh, I don't doubt it, said my mother, flushing red with embarrassment. I'm not saying you're not up to the job. It's just if you do need some jobs that require a man's touch, just ask my husband. I'm sure he'll be only too glad to help. Wouldn't you, Richard? Of course, said my father, interceding. And it goes without saying that if you need any advice or jobs that require a little more brawn, just give me a call. I'll be only too delighted to help. That's very kind of you, said Irma. I'll bear that in mind. I don't mean to pry, said my mother, but where are Luke's parents? Luke looked up from his food with an uncomfortable expression on his face and pinned his steely blue eyes directly on Uma. I watched with interest as Uma began wiping her mouth with her white table napkin very daintily and taking her time about it, almost as if she was debating as to what to tell us, and she looked up at my parents with frightened eyes, almost like a deer that had been caught in headlights. It was an accident. It was a car accident, and they both died, tragically died. I hope you don't mind, but I'd really rather not talk about it, she said, reaching quickly for her fork and ploughing into her food. Oh, I'm so sorry, said my mother. I didn't mean to intrude. She realised she was making our guests feel very uncomfortable, and Uma was not forthcoming about what was obviously a thorny, incommodious issue she didn't wish to discuss in any way. We sensed that when it came to asking any personal questions, she might as well have been wearing a sign which said, private on her dress, questioners will be prosecuted. So from thenceforth we never asked her any awkward questions. As far as we were concerned, Luke and his grandmother were very agreeable, sweet and endearing people. We determined that the tragic demise of Luke's parents had caused them both to clam up and become tight-lipped, secretive and clandestine. We certainly respected their privacy on such personal matters of the heart that clearly provoked and engendered feelings of great lamentation, mournfulness and grievous sorrow that was unambiguously clear to determine and comprehend in the circumstances. I think those two are suffering from post-traumatic shock disorder, my mother told us, once they'd left our home. Poor things! The very mention of their lost family members, and they seemed to become very unnerved. It's very understandable, said my father. The poor boy, losing his parents so tragically like that. It can't be easy. I can only imagine what he's gone through. Still, he does strike me as very mature for such a young age. Well, tragedy does have a way of making people grow up, said my mother. You have to learn the lesson of grief, and that's very tough. Before long, Luke and I became as thick as thieves and were pretty much inseparable, spending all our spare time together, as we were only a month apart in age. We would ride our mountain bicycles down some of those remote back-country roads, or our own horses down many of the rugged horse-riding trails, and we would go exploring the steep rocky inclines, looking for caves and other hiding places in the rocks, and of course we enjoyed playing hide-and-seek together in the wood green. One day as we were riding our bicycles, a mysterious, expensive black Lexus pulled over to the side of the road and indicated for us to stop cycling. Luke looked very skittish and on edge, and I could see his blue eyes seemed to become very round, fearful and rather dismayed. I stopped my bike as I thought that the driver was looking for directions, and maybe I could help. Normally I wouldn't have stopped for a stranger, based on my parents' warnings, but I thought those rules could be overridden on this occasion. I think I was disarmed by the polished, posh black Lexus, along with the air of importance that the stranger appeared to exude, for he would not have looked out of place dealing with world leaders or visiting important diplomats, for I noticed he carried himself with a proud deportment and decorum, and looked to be a man of high standing on very first impressions. As the ambiguous stranger climbed out of the car, it was clear to see that he was not from Kentucky. The man must be lost, I thought. He was definitely not from these parts, for no one dresses with this kind of sartorial elegance in this part of the world. The man towered at 6 foot tall, and wore his thick black hair swept backwards in a funky Elvis Presley-like hairstyle. I noticed he was wearing a swanky black pinstriped suit that fitted his lean body rather like a glove, and a stylish smart blue shirt with fancy gold cufflinks set with opulent diamonds, along with the shiniest black shoes that I've ever seen, that sparkled so much that you could see your own reflection in them. Yet there was something enigmatical and elliptical about this man that made my skin crawl, as his eyes were hidden by a dark pair of stylish designer glasses, and I got the distinct impression he didn't want us to see into his eyes, which did make me suddenly sense that he could not be trusted. I noticed his shaven complexion was rather uneven, and there was a very big jagged pink scar that ran from under his cheek to the edge of his mouth that looked very bumpy like chicken skin, and was really very alarming, making me wonder if he'd been attacked by a knife at some stage in his life. Perhaps he wasn't such an upstanding gentleman after all. "Hello, kids," he said, giving us a broad, very dashing smile that seemed to lack genuine warmth and depth. "I wonder if you may know this little boy," he said, showing us a picture of a young boy with black hair. "I don't know any kids around here," I said, looking at the blurry photograph. "I'm 13 years old. I only know people around my own age, but this photograph is really bad, and even if I did know him, I cannot see him clearly enough in your picture to recognise him at all. I must say he does look rather young, and I haven't seen anyone like that at Sunday school." "It's a very bad picture," the man admitted. "Regretfully, it is like this, but it's all I have. I think he would be about your age now, so obviously he may have changed quite a lot. He would be about 9 when this was taken. I think he would be described as having dark hair and blue eyes." "Well, a lot of people have dark hair and blue eyes, sir," I pointed out. "It's not much to go on." "I understand," he said. "I stopped you because word on the grapevine is that he moved to this area very recently, and I'm trying to get in touch with him." Luke and I looked at the picture and both shook our heads. "Sorry, sir. I wish we could be more help." "His name is Adam Riley," said the man. "Does the name by any chance ring any bells for you?" "No, sorry, sir," I said. "I can't help you. I know of no one of that name, nor has anyone ever moved to the area lately." I had forgotten, of course, that Luke had only just moved to the neighbouring farm, but that didn't count because I felt like I'd known him for several lifetimes already. I turned to Luke. "Do you know anyone that looks like that, Luke?" I asked. Luke looked exceedingly awkward and shrugged his shoulders, and with an air of indifference he said, It's hard to see the photographs, sir. It's very blurry, but there are no boys called Adam living around here. Why are you looking for him, sir? Is he a friend of yours?" The man brushed off Luke's direct questions. "Thanks," said the man, climbing back into the car and whizzing away at an awful speed. "Ooh, I didn't like him, did you?" I said, shuddering. "Something about him. Oh, it felt off." "Not a nice man," Luke agreed. "What's the matter with you?" I asked, looking at Luke, who had grown as white as a sheet and was shaking like a leaf. "You're not afraid of strangers, are you? I know we shouldn't have talked to him, but that man did look rather important. I thought he wanted directions. You could see he didn't live around here. He was rather like a fish out of water, so I kind of felt sorry for him, and I thought it would be rude if we ignored him." It's not that," said Luke. "That man, well, he was looking for me. I'm Adam Riley." "You are kidding," I said, my eyes growing like saucers and my jaw dropping to the ground. But I don't understand. Your name's Luke, and the boy in the picture has dark black raven hair. You're completely blonde." "Luke is not my real name," he said, "and my grandmother dyes my hair blonde for the purposes of my disguise. My real hair colour is very black, and I recognise that photograph. It wasn't taken when I was 9, it was taken when I was 8 years old. Even my grandmother dyes her hair white, and she's grey, for the very same reason. We're both in hiding." "Who are you hiding from?" I asked, looking astonished. "A very, very bad, evil man.
My father, he said. He'll stop at nothing to kidnap me and force me to go back and live with him, and that can never, ever happen. I would rather die than live with him. You're hiding from your own father, but I thought you said he died in a car crash. That was a lie. It is true that my mother is dead, he said. My father was the one who killed her. There was no car accident. We fabricated the story to protect our identities. That's what you do when you don't want people to find out who you really are. It isn't easy being undercover. You are kidding, I said. Why on earth would your father do such a despicable thing to your mother? And if he did, why is he not locked away in prison for her murder? Luke looked very solemn. Things are never as black and white as they seem, he said. That's what Grandma always says. You see, you do sometimes get police that are not on the right side of the law. You do get corrupt law enforcement that can be in with the mob in order to get a cut of the loot. It happens. I will tell you everything, he said, but you must make sure you don't tell another solitary soul what I'm about to tell you. I cross my heart, I assured him. I won't tell a soul. We both parked our bicycles against the hilly embankment on the side of the road and went to sit under a large shaded oak tree in a flowering meadow, while Luke began to tell me his incredible story. And in a strange, rather peculiar way, he seemed almost relieved to get it off his chest, as if the secret had been weighing down his heart heavily. I watched him as he twisted flower petals in his hands as a form of distraction, breaking them up into tiny pieces and throwing them onto the ground in a higgledy-piggledy fashion. My father's called Dennis. He's a gang leader, or a mobster if you like, of a drug cartel. The only way I can describe him to you is he's a murderous thug. My father has done some really bad stuff, and I mean bad stuff. I don't even know everything he's done, but I can only imagine, and imagining is enough. You're scaring me, I said. Like what? What has he done? Let me tell you the story from the beginning. But before I get into the gory, gruesome details that you probably won't want to hear, my mother Marlene actually met my father at a very young age, and he fell in love with her, and they got married. You know how grown-ups do. My grandmother never liked Dennis from the word go. She sensed there was something really off about him. She told me that from the first day she met him, he paced around the place like a peacock, strutting his stuff, as if to say, "Look at me, I'm the best." He had an air of superiority and spoke down to everybody. He dressed like a gangster and wore opulent gold chains around his neck, and flashy big watches and thick signet rings on his fingers, and always dressed in dapper, expensive Italian designer leather jackets and fancy leather loafers. My grandmother knew he was a nasty piece of work from the moment she met him, and she actually witnessed him kicking the neighbour's dog, who was just trying to be friendly to him, and lose his temper over the tiniest of things. Of course, like any protective, dutiful mother, she tried to warn my mother not to marry him. But in those days, my naive mother was headstrong and very beguiled by the tall, dark, handsome stranger that swept her off her feet, wined and dined her at some of New York's finest restaurants, and lavished on her expensive clothes and jewellery. I think in those days my mother found his charm impossible to resist, as he laid it on thick. Was your mother pretty? I asked. Yes, but not in your standard conventional way, like you see in the magazines. I don't think my father was interested in that type of girl. My mother was more fresh, homespun, innocent, naive, not sophisticated, but pretty. Yes, pretty. Sorry, go on with your story, I said. I didn't mean to interrupt. Well, after my mother had been married to my dad, she soon began to see all these really villainous, iniquitous ruffian types visiting the house at all hours of the night, and would tell my grandmother everything, as they were incredibly close, and she wasn't happy about these night-time visitations. It was like something scandalous and untoward was going on. She said she knew that my father was up to something nefarious, and it was deeply troubling and disturbing for her, and caused her undue distress. My mother would hear Dennis talking for hours on end with the living room door locked, and sometimes she would hear him scream, "If you don't do as I say, I will kill you and your family. Do you understand?" And she would hear bangs on occasions, like a gun going off, or a terrified, discomposing, distressed scream that was so petrifying it sounded like someone was being seriously harmed inside that very room, almost like they were being terrorized. You could hear the cries of pain and agony, and it was brutal and would leave my mother in a state of panic, wondering if she should call the police or not. She would sometimes squirrel me away to my grandmother's cottage at the bottom of the yard, as she was so concerned about the unexplainable activity back at the house. When she started to ask my father what on earth was going on, he would beat her up so viciously and tell her to keep her mouth shut, or she would be very sorry. She ended up going to accident and emergency for various fractures, and my grandmother kept telling her to go to the police, but she simply refused point blank. I think she was terribly afraid of my father and was too scared to leave him, lest he should take me away from her, which he always threatened to do. He'd say, "I'll kill you, and I'll keep Adam." As I got older, my father became more and more involved in this insidious underground world, and we soon cottoned on to the fact that he was very much dealing with drugs, and I believe he was the gang leader because he called out all the shots, and everybody did his bidding on command. You could see people were absolutely petrified of my father, as he was a vicious, brutal man, without a shred of compassion. Yet towards me he exhibited a very gentle and kind demeanour, as I was the light of his life, and he lavished all his loving attention upon me, and would get me to sit on his lap while we watched television together. But I hated and despised him because of the way he beat my mother up. I couldn't forgive him for that. I knew my mother was desperately sad, because I would hear her sobbing at night in her bedroom, and my father would scream at her, calling her all kinds of obscene names, and telling her to shut up. One day when I came home from school, I noticed the door to the living room that my father permanently kept locked was now ajar, and I could hear my father was swimming outside in the pool, doing his 100 laps. I've never been in that room before, so I wanted to take a quick peek. I think he must have accidentally left the door open, so this was the perfect opportunity for me to snoop. I was inquisitive and curious by nature, and still am, and so I tiptoed into the living room, if you could call it that. It was really a large, swanky, well-appointed room. The far end was a living area with coffee tables and leather settees that opened out into the patio and finally the swimming area. The front part of the room was like an office, cum bar if you like, with gleaming oak-polished desks and chairs and large shining ornate, intricately carved wooden cabinets that were all graced with hundreds and hundreds of crystal decanters filled with all kinds of alcohol, and there was also big boxes of thick Cuban cigars lying around. I saw this round thing wrapped up in a black plastic bag sitting on an opulent silver tray on the desktop, right next to a big silver ice decanter filled with ice. And whatever it was dripping red droplets of blood on the black and white marble floor. I pulled back the black bag cautiously to see what was inside, and then I began to scream, as I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I could see a decapitated head of a thuggish man that I remember seeing once before visiting my father, but the last time I'd seen him, he was alive. Now he was dead. "You're kidding," I said. "You saw a human head in a black bag on a table in your father's office?" Luke nodded. On hearing my terrified screams, my mother bolted into the room, and seeing the decapitated head on the silver tray, she began to scream. She took me into her arms and then got me to hide behind the curtain because we could hear my father's wet footsteps running from the pool through the sliding doors back into the room. "What are you doing in my private office?" my father yelled at my mother. "Get out of here now! You know you're not allowed in here." "Where did this head come from?" my mother cried. "What have you done? Are you completely insane?" I could hear her sobbing. "I'm going to call the police," she said to my father. "You need locking up. You're seriously, seriously sick. No one normal can do this. You've murdered a human being. How can you even look at yourself in the mirror?" "He got what he deserved," said my father, holding my mother hostage against the wall, while pinning his hands around her neck. "That's what happens to men if they betray me," he barked to my mother. If you don't keep your mouth shut either, your head will be next to his on this desk. Do you understand?" "I will go to the police," my mother piped. "I will tell them everything evil that you've done. You just can't get away with this." "Oh, and you'll speak to the big boss," laughed my dad, "who just so happens to be my business partner. He's making good dough out of me. Real good dough. I don't think your reporting me is going to get you very far. With any luck, you'll get committed to the nut house on my recommendation, and then you'll never see our son again." I was hiding behind the curtain, and tears were pouring down my cheeks, and my heart was thumping violently in my chest. I was hoping my mother would shut up before my father became more belligerent and out of control, but instead she kept challenging and threatening him to tell the authorities about his heinous, despicable crimes, and she just wouldn't shut up. All of a sudden, everything became deadly quiet in the room. So quiet that you could hear a pin drop. And then I heard a strange, choking sound. And that must be when he strangled my mother. Then I finally peered through the curtains, and my father was dragging my mother's deceased body across the carpet by her stockinged legs. I remember being so horrified that I was barely able to move a single muscle. I was frozen to the spot. "He killed your mother?" I gasped. I think my mother had just had enough of my father's duplicitous shenanigans. She was beginning to fight back, and that's why my dad killed her. "She was very brave," I said. "Brave and foolish," said Luke. "That's what Granny says." "What did you do next?" I asked. "You must have been terrified out of your life." "Well, once my father left the room, I ran to my grandmother's cottage, and she lived on the property at the bottom of the yard. She took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. I just said, 'He killed her.' We bolted to the car and drove to the airport. My mother had told my grandmother to run away with me if anything should happen to her, and she had given my mother all the money we could possibly need to start a brand new life. She had taken a great deal of my father's money behind his back. So now you know why Grandma and I are living alone on the farm. We're in hiding from my father, hoping and praying he'll never find us. So that's why the man was asking questions. He was clearly hired by your father to look for you. What are you going to do? Because he seems to have picked up on your trail." Granny and I have been very careful not to leave a paper trail to avoid being discovered. But I'm not going to tell her what happened because she'll want us to move again. And I'm so happy here, I don't fancy moving away. I love it here. And you have become like a sister to me. I don't want to lose our friendship. You won't say anything, will you?" "Of course not," I said. "I also love you like a brother, and I don't want you to go either. If anyone asks, I'll pretend you're my birth brother, if that helps." A whole year went by, and Luke and I were quick to forget about the strange man in the black fancy Lexus, until one day it happened all over again, and the very same man tried to flag us down. But upon seeing him, we cycled away as fast as we possibly could. "Adam!" screamed the man. "Come back! I know it's you. I've come to take you to your father. He wants to see you. Come on now, be reasonable." Luke looked at me in alarm, and we dumped our bicycles on the side of the embankment and began to sprint as fast as we could into the heart of the wood green, with the man running after us, firing warning shots, which were clearly designed to intimidate us, as there was no possible way that this man would kill Luke, so we just kept running. It was fortunate that we knew the wood green so well that we could find the perfect quintessential place to hide, which was a little rock with a small enough gap behind it, by which the two of us could conceal our bodies without being seen or discovered. It was only by random chance that we had found this incredible hiding place a long time ago, and so we were confident we were pretty safe and were unlikely to be discovered. I was about 14 at the time, and being shot was the scariest thing that had ever happened in my life, so my heart was thundering violently in my chest, and my breathing was very heavy. I peered out cautiously from behind the rock,
and could see the smart man in his pinstriped suit walking around the wood green with his gun in his hands that he kept reloading with cartridges and randomly firing. He started yelling out, "I'm going to stay here all night if I have to, Adam Riley. I'm going to smoke you out. Your father wants you to come home with me, and I won't leave these woods without you." Imagine the life you could lead with your father. Expensive cars, all the money you could ever want, expensive toys, fancy holidays. You could have it all, boy. Why would you want to live in a dump like this? For how long we hid behind the rock, I do not know, but it was very clear that the man was looking for us. All of a sudden we could hear what I can only describe as distant chattering, and I realised that people were walking towards us, and I could see the smart man looking rather apprehensive, almost as if he didn't know what course of action he should take, so he quickly took cover behind a tree to hide from the walkers. All of a sudden the two chattering people came into focus, but they were not human at all. Well, not exactly. These incongruous humanoid creatures must have been about 7 foot tall and 3 feet wide across the shoulder area, and possibly 500 pounds or even more. They were covered in long, flowing, dark, glistening brown hair, and they both had pert breasts, so they must have been female. It was ironic because they were so involved in a garrulous conversation and were talking excitedly, backwards and forwards in a very fast language as they walked, with their stooped backs and swinging overlong arms that hung below their knees. Luke and I were absolutely astonished. Neither of us had ever seen creatures like this before. They were so human, but they had ape-like influences to their appearance, which was clearly apparent, especially in the pyramid shape of the head that folded seamlessly into the shoulders. We were too far to see the details of the creature's face that appeared to be rather obscure. All of a sudden the creature appeared to smell something because she stopped dead in her tracks, with her nose in the air, and began to sniff. I watched in astonishment as she quickly nudged her friend and pointed towards the tree where the tall stranger was hiding. The man who was hiding behind the tree, on realising he'd been spotted, pounced out of the tree line and began firing at the creatures at random, while they kept jumping out of the way of his bullets, so that the man began to miss every time. I think he must have realised that his gun was no match for these creatures, which were so imposing and impressive in size. I could see he was trembling so much. He was shaking violently and was terribly, terribly afraid. I'm not sure what happened, but the man kept reloading his gun as fast as he possibly could. He was so frantic that he was just firing all over the place with no sense of control or coordination. I think his palms were probably sweating profusely, and the gun he was holding was possibly slipping precariously in his hands, disabling his firm grip. I watched in horror as he fired another round, and then one of his bullets ricocheted, bouncing backwards, hitting him directly in the chest, and he fell backwards, dying on impact, killed by his own bullet. It was the most bizarre, incongruous and outlandish scene that I've ever witnessed before in my life. Being killed by your own bullet, I mean. The two female creatures did not show any aggression, which was in itself extraordinary, but perhaps it was because everything unfolded so fast, and they were too stunned to even react. I watched them gliding over to the man, and was astonished to see that he had effectively killed himself, and they stood there talking over the dead body, discussing it in detail, as they found what had happened to be of great fascination, and I think they were trying to make sense of it. They looked like two nattering women at a tea party, talking non-stop. They got incredibly excited when they saw the man's diamond cufflinks, and each creature took off a cufflink to keep for themselves, and they were thrilled about it. They kept examining the piece of jewellery over and over again, in total awe. Finally the creatures just glided away, but they never stopped talking, not even once. We could still hear their excited voices from far away. Of course, all these years later, I now know that the mysterious creatures we encountered were Bigfoots. Luke and I cycled back home hurriedly, and he begged me not to tell anyone what had transpired, and how he'd so nearly been kidnapped by a villainous man who was connected to his father in some way, and had obviously been paid handsomely to find him.
Luke was so tired of living in hiding, and the last thing he wanted was to move away and to live a life forever on the run. So to cut a long story short, the body of the strange man was soon recovered and identified by the police as a man that they'd had their eye on for a long time and was heavily involved with a drug cartel. Once one domino fell, then everything else followed in sequence, and finally the whole drug cartel staggered to its knees as people were arrested and incarcerated, with the exception of Luke's father, who had managed to escape the wrath of the law. It was only a month later when Luke came running to my farmhouse, and he had a thrilled expression on his face. "What's up?" I asked. "Why do you look so pleased?" "Did you look at the paper this morning?" he asked me. "Of course not," I said. "I never read the papers. They're so boring." "I'm free," said Luke. "I never have to hide ever again. I can live in Kentucky forever and ever," he said, dancing around in joyous circles like an excitable dog. "Has your father been arrested?" I asked, looking amazed. "Have they finally found him?" "No, someone shot him dead on Monday night. His body's been recovered." "You shouldn't look so pleased about that," I said. "I mean, he's still your father." "Are you kidding?" said Luke. "My father is evil. I'm glad he's gone. He's not my father. Maybe by blood, but not in here," he said, pointing to my heart. "And it's in here that counts." "You're right," I said. "Boy, I'm happy for you. You finally are free." "What are you two looking so pleased about?" asked my mother, watching us with an amused expression on her face. "You look like you've won the lottery, Luke." "Oh, believe me, Miss Fleming, I've won the lottery, in a manner of speaking. And by the way, my name isn't Luke, it's Adam Riley." My mother smiled. "Adam Riley? I like that name very much," she said. So there you are. That's my story. My strange, rather incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins in a way that I never imagined possible. For indeed, I never considered that a Bigfoot story would ever cross my path, and certainly not in the way that it did. As invariably, you always assume that a Bigfoot encounter is rather like the lottery, which means I never thought I would actually hit the jackpot myself. Well, certainly not in quite the way that I did. It all began when the COVID-19 pandemic broke around the world, which made my mother become unduly alarmed about my grandmother, who was in her 80s. At the time, she'd been living in a residential care home where a few people had suddenly just died from COVID. My mother thought that my grandmother might be predisposed and vulnerable to the virus given her age, fragility and weakened immune system, which was why she was desirous for her to move into our house forthwith, an idea that was exceedingly unbecoming to my father, who became very aggrieved and indignant about such a horrifying prospect. For a while, our normally tranquil, peace-loving home became rather like a war zone, where the verbal battles ensued in our sofa-covered living room and carpeted home. As my parents argued incessantly, my obstinate, pertinacious mother invariably always seemed to get her way in the end, and so for a couple of days our house descended into darkness as my sullen father sulked in the corner, barely saying a single word, while my mother prepared the spare room on the first floor of our home for my elderly grandmother Ruth. Within 2 days, she'd moved into our home. My grandmother Ruth is a very sweet, frail, elderly woman who's actually as sharp as a hawk and incredibly observant. Yet at the same time, she's as gentle as a doe. I've always warmed to her because she is such a gentle, warm-hearted and congenial sort of person, and yet at the very same time humorous as well. I remember when I was helping her unpack in her bedroom, she actually said to me, "Oh, I hope I'm not going to be an inconvenience for you all. I can see that your father isn't very happy to have me around, and I can't say I really blame him for that. This is all very awkward for all of us." "Don't worry about him, Granny," I said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Dad's just very set in his ways, that's all. He finds it rather difficult to adjust to different living circumstances. I wouldn't worry about it at all if I was you. He just needs to acclimatise to having you around, and once he's adjusted, he'll be fine, I promise you of that. I know what he's like." "Oh, I hope you're right," chided my grandmother, looking more than a little doubtful. I began to help my grandmother unpack,
while she sat back on a comfortable chair watching me and directing me as to where to put her various things. Before long I was placing her neatly folded clothes into various drawers and hanging up all her pretty dresses and coats. I was about to put this long cardboard box into the cupboard when I discerned that it was full of these most magnificent drawings. "Granny," I said in shock, putting the box onto the bed and going through the pictures in awe. "These pictures are absolutely incredible. The colours are marvellous, and the drawings are exquisite. Did you draw these?" I asked. "They're stunning." "Yes, I did. When I was a young girl. Well, some of them anyway. Not all of them." "I never knew you were an artist," I said, sifting through the pictures very briefly. "You certainly know how to keep your light hidden under a bushel, Granny. You're a real talent, if ever I saw one." My grandmother chuckled. "That's very kind of you to say so, dear. In those days I enjoyed drawing a great deal. I was a young girl then. It was one thing I could always do that didn't break the bank for my family. We were very poor back then." I sat down on the bed in my grandmother's bedroom and glanced through the pictures very briefly that she had drawn. Some were of her home, the pretty countryside, and even her family. And then there was another picture that caused the hair on the back of my head to stand on end, and my eyes to grow round as saucers, and my jaw to drop to the ground. My grandmother had drawn the perfect picture of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. How could she even have known about such a creature, I pondered. I was absolutely stumped. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice expressing concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Your skin has grown as white as a sheet." "Granny," I said, waving the picture of the Bigfoot towards her, "what's this that you've drawn here?" My grandmother giggled. "Oh, that's Mops. Well, that's what my mother used to call him when I was growing up, because his rag-tailed hair looked like a mop. It was long and shaggy. He was a funny old thing, really." "You mean you knew this creature?" I asked, looking absolutely amazed. I sat down on her bed and insisted my grandmother told me the entire story from start to finish. So this is what she told me in her own words, which I now reveal to you. "Well, dear," she proceeded to tell me, "I grew up in the late Depression in the Appalachian, Kentucky area that stretches from Alabama to southern Pennsylvania. It was in the 1930s, and those grueling times were very hard indeed for the all of us, as there was very little employment back then due to the 1929 stock market crash, inexperienced Federal Reserve, and ill-timed tariffs, all collectively contributing to the ailing economy at the time. In those days we had to be very diligent and prudent and learn to survive, and that's what we did back then. We industrially grew our own vegetables and bottled and preserved them for the winter months. We raised chickens for eggs and we had a goat for milk. You really didn't have a choice in the matter, even if you wanted to. We were very frugal in those days, and we had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make do or go without. As a child, I'd scamper around the open wilderness in my bare feet, as shoes then were so expensive and my parents couldn't afford to buy me any. I never owned a pair of my own for a very long time. I would end up getting bitten by insects or spiky thorns would get embedded into my feet. But one day my father used the skins from a dead animal to make me a pair of boots, and that changed my life for the better, as he was a very resourceful man, and I still say to this very day that those boots were the very best I've ever owned. Even though things were very tough and Spartan in those days, I had a beautiful, idyllic and magical childhood, and when you're young and innocent, you believe that the thrifty, provident way that you live is perfectly normal, because you don't know any better. You think that being frugal and penny-wise is the natural way to survive, not like it is today, dear, where there is just so much wastage in absolutely everything. It wasn't like that then. In those days we lived on meagre scant offerings, and we would eat potatoes with onions and hot dogs to fill up, or other cheap foods like beans, brown rice, oats and canned tuna or salmon, or sometimes mac and cheese. I remember one of my favourite foods was biscuits with creamed salmon. We lived in a very small rustic wooden cabin where we shared one queen-size bed together, which was occupied by both of my parents, my older brother Larry, and then me, of course. We would all have to squeeze together in one bed, but during the winter months it was very snug because we would keep each other incredibly warm. As a kid, I loved playing in the wilderness, the vast open prairies, the streams and the heavily wooded areas on our land. Growing up, Mops was a very normal part of my young life, and I played with him all the time. Of course, he was physically different to me, but when you're young, you accept people at face value and respect them the way they are, without considering their physical differences as strange or peculiar. Indeed, I never thought of such matters in regards to Mops. Granted, he was covered in long flowing brown hair, and he had feet that were padded at the bottom like a cat's, which I used to envy because he'd never get thorns in his feet or anything like that. He was able to run over the rough terrain and even on the snow with ease without getting his feet all cold. He was a creature of few words, but that really didn't matter to me. But he did speak to his mother in a chattering language, which I always found incredibly funny. When I was 10 years old, Mops was already about 5 foot tall and very heavy and stockily built. Not that that ever bothered me at the time. His height or his size was never an issue for me. Sometimes his height was a huge advantage for me because he could reach the fruit on the trees that I couldn't get to, like peaches and apples, which was great, or biscuits that my mother had hidden from us on the top shelf of the pantry. We would play hide and seek, and Mops could hide in plain sight, and I'd never be able to find him. He was great at just vanishing into thin air, and he loved it when I couldn't discover his hiding spot. It used to drive me completely potty, so eventually he made himself a little easier to find, or I'd have given up on that game in a heartbeat. Yes, but I don't understand is how Mops just became a part of your family and your life in the first place. Well, that's another story, dear. I must have been about 2 years old, and my mother had placed me in a playpen outside my quaint little rustic cabin. It was like a fenced-in area that my father had made out of wooden pegs to keep me contained. In those days they could not afford toys, but my parents would put pine cones into the playpen and interesting pieces of driftwood, along with paper and crayons for me to play with, and I would be entertained while my mother cleaned out the house, always keeping her steely eyes pinned on me. One day when my mother came out into the yard to attend to my needs, she discovered little Mops had been placed in the playpen next to me. We were playing together very happily, like a couple of naughty juvenile toddlers, although Mops was physically bigger than me at the time. My mother was rather surprised and bewildered to see Mops in the playpen, and she wisely speculated that he was indeed the child of the wild woman, and instinctively sensed she needed her to babysit Mops, so that's exactly what she did. The wild woman would come and collect Mops later in the day, although she was never observed doing so by my mother. I think my mother was secretly pleased that I had a companion to play with, which meant I would get up to less mischief and was kept preoccupied by my little friend. I do remember she scrubbed Mops down a few times with a scrubbing brush and plenty of soap, and brushed out all the knots in his hair with a hairbrush, and he screamed blue murder like a baby because it hurt so much when my mother worked on all those tangles of his. After that fiasco, Mops was always wary of my mother, and when she came after him with a hairbrush, he would run and hide. He was so terrified of that thing, and if he saw a hairbrush, he would start to tremble and wobble like a jelly. If my mother ever wanted Mops to leave the house, all she had to do was wave that hairbrush at him, and he would vanish from sight, and we wouldn't see him for the rest of the day. Every time she upset Mops, he would spray the wall like a domestic cat in revenge and leave the most pungent odour behind in our house that would literally burn the back of your throats and hurt your eyes. It was a putrid smell, rather like hot garbage, and my mother hated it. Did your mother know this wild woman? I asked. No, you see, the introverted wild woman was very reticent, evasive and bashful, but my mother had seen her in passing in the wood green, and their eyes met on many occasions. I think she liked the timorous wild woman and understood her dividends better than most. You see, growing up, my mother herself had been painfully shy, so she rarely related to the demure wild woman. I know she spotted her capricious elderly partner once or twice in the forest, whom she described as a very sizable, fractious old fellow, whom she believed was a little cantankerous, grouchy and rather moody. You could tell he was old, as his grey hair was turning white, and his leathery, weathered grey face looked literally ancient and shrivelled up like a wizened old tortoise. That was how wrinkled he was. She perceived that the wild woman brought Mops to play with me so that his mischievous games and animated high-pitched whoops would not upset and unnerve the cranky, crotchety old fellow. I do remember when I was playing in the sylvan with Mops, the crusty old fellow heard us as we were chasing each other around the grove. I was shrieking wildly with laughter, and Mops was whooping in delight because he perceived that I'd never catch him, as Mops could run like the wind. I've never seen anything that could run that fast. I will never forget the petulant old fellow who'd been watching us sternly with angry eyes. He lunged towards me, shaking his gargantuan fists at me in a furious rage, and he began to scream so loudly that he sounded like a woman being murdered. Then he curled back his lips and unleashed the most terrifying growl and leered at me with his hostile eyes. I could tell that he was incandescent with rage, which caused my whole body to shake like a leaf. I was certain in that moment that the quick-tempered old man was about to hit me really hard, but that was when the unassuming wild woman came to my immediate rescue. She ushered the old man away, talking to him very softly in a chattering tone that seemed to calm him down. I always got the impression that Mops kept a safe distance from the narky old fellow, as I think he was fickle at the very best of times. He was a scary individual. He was thickly built like an army tank, and was easily over 8 foot tall and even more than 700 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide. Over the years, the magnanimous wild woman brought my family generous open-handed gifts of deers, hogs, rabbits, fish, and other food sources in exchange for taking care of Mops. We would discover these bountiful trophies on our front door, along with a bucket of wild berries or fruits from time to time, which my mother would bottle or make into delicious jams. As far as my parents were concerned, looking after Mops was a lifesaver for our family. It was like earning a very decent, highly desirable wage package, because it meant we had meat every single day of our lives, which alleviated our hunger pangs and satiated us considerably. It would seem that life became a great deal better and easier for us in our home, because we all went to bed with full satisfied stomachs, thanks to the wild woman, and we were healthier too. My father, who had never been best pleased about my relationship with Mops and thought it was a bit unusual, shut up after the meat kept arriving on our doorstep, let me tell you that. Whereabouts did Mops live? I asked. Well, he lived in the woods in a cave with his mother and dad. I remember he showed me the place once when we were playing in the grove. You would never have known it was even there. It was concealed by thick brush and thicket, and it was fully protected from all the elements. It was a cosy, sumptuous den, lined with lots of animal pelts and tree stumps and so forth. So how long were you friends with Mops? I asked. I think I was about 12 years old when Mops and his mother went away to pastures new, because they were, like nomads, following waterways, railway lines and animal trails, as that's how the wild men in those days lived. I think the only reason they stayed in our vicinity for so long is because of the grumpy old man, who was tired and weary and incapacitated by his leg that appeared to give him a great deal of trouble. He would drag it on the ground behind him. My mother believed it had once been caught in a trap before and had given him a great deal of grief ever since. She thought that he might have insufferable pain, which could have accounted for his volatile temper. Of course, when he died, everything changed after that. It was a very sad, grievous time for the all of us. Even my father missed the free meat deliveries at our front doorstep, and life went downhill from then on, as we had to resort to living on beans and rice, and it wasn't easy, let me tell you. How did the old man die? I asked. Well, I remember one day the wild woman beckoned to my mother and indicated for her to follow her, which was a very big deal for us because she was desperately shy, and although she would make her presence known, she liked to remain hidden in the shadows. We barely ever saw her unless she crossed our path and glanced at us ever so briefly. On this occasion, however, the wild woman stepped out of her comfort zone, which wasn't easy for her at all, and she led my mother to the open grave that she had dug in the grove, only yards away from where the cave was where the family lived. I remember getting such a shock when I observed the old man lying next to the open grave, with his deceased body. It was so withered. I could see that despite his great size and girth, he was emaciated and drawn. I'd never seen a dead body before that, and in my eyes he was very human to me, despite all the hair and his gargantuan size. I must say he looked very peaceful in death.
My mother believed he'd died in his sleep or something, and you could see that the wild woman loved him so very much. I could discern the distress in her eyes and how desperately sad she was. I remember my mother took the wild woman into her arms and they locked in a warm embrace. She patted her gently on her hair-covered back, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry, you poor, poor thing. It must be very hard for the both of you." The wild woman really looked comforted by my mother's kind, gentle words and the compassion that she showed her. I could tell that she loved my mother very much, even though they had so little contact. She patted my mother's back as well. It was an emotional, loving embrace. Was Mop sad about his dad's death? No, not really. I think he was actually rather relieved, to tell you the truth. I sensed his fractious relationship with his father was combustible at the very best of times. I think the poor old man possibly found Mops rather too rambunctious and feisty for his liking. So what happened next? Well, the wild woman buried the old man while we all watched the procedure. It was really rather peculiar, but she wanted to include us in the ceremony, and I realised then that she considered us a huge part of her life, which was incredibly moving, especially for my mother, who was touched to the quick. I noticed Mama was actually crying when the old man was buried. I think she was so sad for the wild woman. Once the old man was buried, the wild woman put some sticks into the ground to mark the grave, and then she let out the most appallingly loud howls. I even began to weep when she howled, because you could feel her desperate pain. And then once she'd finished grieving, she pointed towards the east, and my mother knew that they were leaving and moving on. We were all grievously sad, and said our goodbyes. I remember we patted each other on the backs and nodded, and I just wept and wept when I saw them go. It really felt like a death and a dreadful loss. I was so sad. I remember after they left, life got really hard again. Obviously, we no longer had the meat deliveries from the wild woman, and I missed Mop so much. He had been my very best friend growing up. I never stopped crying for days. I used to beg God to bring him back to us, but he and his mother, they never returned. I begged God to make them return, but it just never happened. My mother believed that the wild woman, who was still very young at the time, had possibly found a new love. My mother was so sad. She told me she never realised how much the wild people had impacted her life. We always went to the grave of the old man and prayed for him and laid down flowers for him on the anniversary of his death every single year. "Wow," I said, "what a story." I said this looking at the picture my gran had painted of the critter with a pyramid-shaped head, overlong arms and hair-covered body. As my grandmother looked at the picture, I could see the tears welling in her eyes and streaking and falling down her cheeks as she remembered little Mops. "So this is Mops," I said, studying the picture. "It's a really good picture. He looks really sweet. His eyes look very kind." My grandmother was still crying, wiping away her tears. "Oh, he was kind," she said, "very kind." "And if you think that's a good picture," she said, "look at these." My grandmother showed me some other pictures that had been meticulously done by a fine artist. "Who did these?" "These were done by Mops." "Mops drew these pictures?" I asked in astonishment. My grandmother nodded. "He was a great artist, and we would draw together for hours. He was far better than me. He knew how to draw the natural world. You see, he knew it so much better than I did." "That's extraordinary," I said. "He was such a phenomenal artist. I can't believe it." Suddenly I remembered the picture from the Patterson gymlan footage, and I took out my mobile phone and showed the footage to my grandmother. I wanted to see what she thought of the creature that many have speculated for so long and wondered if it was real. "What do you think of this footage, Granny?" I asked. "That looks a lot like the wild woman," said my grandmother, "only she was much taller and slimmer. But she did look like that. It's a great footage," she said, "and it's definitely real. It's not fake. You can see the muscles moving under the arms, and you can see the areas where the animal doesn't have hair. That was similar to the wild woman." As you can imagine, I was thrilled that my grandmother could share this story with me, and if she had not stayed in our home, I would never have known about her encounter with the hairy man.
I told my grandmother that the critters are known as Bigfoot, but she said Mops and the Wild Woman were like people to her, but people with hair and pyramid-shaped faces and very powerful, strong bodies. But they're just like us, she told us, with emotions and feelings. Don't ever forget that. You cannot say they're animals because they're intelligent and discerning. I did tell her that some people had terrifying encounters with the critters, and she believes that they are actually misunderstood. They do have an intrinsic ability to read your mind, she did tell me. I do know Mops was always able to know what I was thinking. And that was proven one day when we played a game where I'd draw a picture on a piece of paper and he had to guess what I'd drawn. And he always got it right. If I drew an apple or a house, he drew exactly what I'd drawn. So he was very, very telepathic. I imagine if a hunter was thinking I'm going to kill this wild man, he would be in pretty much big trouble, because the wild man would already have perceived his thoughts and quickly defend himself. Also, if you display fear, that would be a red flag to a wild man. You see, the wild man would see your fear as an invitation to attack, as all the other animals they hunt are afraid of them as well. But do you believe that there are bad wild men? Of course I do, just as there are bad men in our world. It really is not much different than that. The problem is if you're dealing with an aggressive wild man, you'll be in big trouble because they're colossal, dangerous, and they'll kill you in a heartbeat. My grandmother still lives in our house to this day, and my father has warmed to her considerably because she's a very likeable old lady. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.